The tires crunched over a bed of brittle pine needles the moment I turned off the main road. I didn't realize how long I'd been driving, or how far the asphalt had ended and the forest had begun. The sky was folding into dusk, but the trees stretched higher than my headlights could reach, blackened spires leaning closer to each other, whispering secrets I couldn't hear. I pulled the car over, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The cabin wasn't supposed to be far, only a few hundred feet down a barely there dirt track. But even now, staring through the windshield, I wasn't sure which shadow was the path, and which was the forest swallowing the path whole. I stepped out and felt the night air wrap around me. It smelled of wet moss and something older, like the kind of decay that never fully leaves. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and each step seemed louder than it should have been. I shouldn't have noticed, but there were footprints, human footprints, deep and heavy, leading both toward the cabin and away from it, as if someone had walked here yesterday and planned to return today. Or maybe someone was still walking here. The cabin came into view in fragments. At first it was only a dark silhouette, half hidden by the thick trunks and the drooping boughs of the pines. The paint was peeling, the roof sagging, but it wasn't abandoned in a straightforward sense. Smoke rose from the chimney, slow and curling, but the scent of it was faint, almost like memory rather than real fire. My gut tightened. I couldn't explain why I expected it to be empty. This was just a cabin, after all. But the instinct was there, like a warning buried under my curiosity. I walked toward the porch, and every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. The steps creaked as I climbed them, and for a moment I thought I heard someone moving inside, soft shuffling against the old wooden floors. I stopped. Nothing. Just the wind, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. I rubbed my hands together, trying to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. My eyes traced the windows. One was cracked, another clouded with grime so thick it caught the last light of day and reflected it back at me in dull, ghostly glimmers. I reached the door. The handle was cold, almost shocking to touch, and it didn't turn at first. When it finally did, it swung open with a low groan that felt too loud in the quiet. Inside, the air was warmer but heavy, stale. Dust motes floated in the fading light, and the smell, old wood, damp pine, and something else, something I couldn't name, settled on my skin like a warning. I let the door swing shut behind me and listened. The forest pressed in on all sides, but now the walls of the cabin seemed to press in too. I couldn't decide if I was safer inside or out there among the trees. The cabin itself was small, nothing remarkable except the way it seemed to remember the people who'd been here. There were scratches in the floorboards, tiny gouges that weren't recent but weren't entirely old either. Some furniture was intact, some broken or overturned, as if the previous occupant had left suddenly or been forced to. I ran my hand along the back of a wooden chair and felt a splinter that shouldn't have been there. My heart sped up. I had come expecting isolation, yes, but I hadn't expected a cabin that felt alive and watching. I walked slowly from room to room, each step deliberate, each breath a little louder than I wanted it to be. The kitchen smelled faintly of iron, though nothing in there had been used in years. Plates and mugs were stacked neatly on the shelves, almost too neatly considering the rest of the place. And then just as I reached for the window, I noticed the faintest smudge, like a handprint left long ago or maybe yesterday. My pulse thumped in my ears. I wiped it with my sleeve. It was cold to the touch. The main room had a fireplace, its stones blackened but cold. Above it, a portrait hung, crooked, depicting a family I couldn't place. Their eyes seemed tired in a way that made me uncomfortable. I felt as if the weight of their gaze had followed me from the moment I opened the door. I wondered what had happened here, why the cabin had survived storms and seasons while it seemed everything else around it had been reclaimed by the woods. And more importantly, I wondered if whatever had survived was still here. I moved toward the back where the hall narrowed. Shadows pooled there, deeper than any the fading light could have caused. A door at the end of the hallway was closed, small and old, its paint cracked. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitant. I didn't know if I wanted to see what was behind it. The air shifted suddenly, and I felt that brush of movement, subtle, almost like a sigh. Something small or maybe nothing at all. Still, my stomach twisted. I turned back to the main room, trying to shake the tension, and that's when I noticed it. An indentation in the floor near the fireplace, like a small rug had been dragged recently. The shape of it was odd, long, narrow, and strangely deliberate. Whoever or whatever had left it had intended me to notice. A warning or an invitation. I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Outside, the wind picked up. Branches tapped against the walls, soft, rhythmic like a signal. I imagined voices carried on it, whispering my name, or maybe just whispering. I couldn't distinguish meaning from static. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step back into my car, drive until I reached the main road, until the forest and its secrets were behind me. And yet I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the boards of the cabin, as if something in the place needed me to stay, at least a little while longer. I found a small cot in a corner, draped with a threadbare blanket. I set my bag down on it and tried to focus on something mundane. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of damp wood, the uneven shadows that the windows threw across the walls. But the mind is never satisfied with mundane in a place like this. My thoughts kept wandering back to that door, the one at the end of the hallway, closed, holding secrets I couldn't name, and beyond it. I felt the forest pressing against the cabin, or maybe the cabin pressing against me, blurring the line between inside and out. I lit a small lantern I had brought, the soft glow painting the walls in muted gold. Dust swirled in the light, catching on something in the corner. I froze. A small trinket, a toy, or maybe a figurine carved roughly, sitting as though it had been waiting for me. I bent down and it felt colder than it should have been, heavier too, and I could swear for a moment I felt a heartbeat, faint, almost imperceptible. I straightened quickly, heart hammering. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or the air moving through the cabin, or just my imagination. But as I sat there, the forest outside quieting in preparation for night, I realized I had already crossed a line. The forest had let me in, the cabin had let me in, and something in me had agreed to stay. I didn't know what awaited behind the closed door, or in the shadows beyond the firelight. I only knew that the first night in the pines would not be quiet. Not really. And as the wind whispered against the walls, brushing in through cracks and unseen gaps, I understood that even if I left tomorrow, the forest would not release me so easily. I found it almost immediately. The hall at the back of the cabin narrowed, the floorboards thinner here, creaking sharply under my weight. The walls leaned in closer than they should have, as if the house itself wanted to hide this part of itself. At first, I thought it was just a regular door, old and unused. But the moment my eyes settled on it, something in the air shifted. It wasn't just old, it was deliberate, like it had been sealed for a reason. The paint was cracked, gray peeling to reveal darker wood beneath, and the hinges were rusted, frozen in time. I put my hand on the knob and it didn't turn, not at first. It was cold to the touch, colder than the rest of the cabin, almost icy, and for a moment I imagined the metal biting into my skin. My fingers trembled. I didn't know why, but I felt like touching it at all was a mistake. Something behind the door knew I was here. I stepped back and looked closer. There were marks carved into the wood, shallow but deliberate. Symbols or letters I couldn't quite make out. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Almost like someone had traced them over and over, leaving faint impressions that the light caught in odd angles. I bent down, squinting, trying to read them. My mind wanted them to be meaningless scratches, but the more I stared, the more they seemed to shift, as if they were moving slightly under my gaze. I stepped away and ran my hand along the wall. The air here was heavier, damp with something I couldn't name. It smelled faintly of iron and ash, like old blood mixed with smoke. My stomach twisted. I thought about calling it a day, leaving the door closed, pretending I hadn't seen it. But curiosity, it always comes back, doesn't it, pulled me closer again. I searched the hallway for something I could use, a crowbar maybe, or even just a sturdy stick, but the cabin offered nothing. I was alone with the door, with the weight of its silence pressing against me. I placed my shoulder against it, heart hammering, and tried to push. It didn't budge, not even a fraction. That's when I noticed the small gap at the bottom. Barely a finger could fit, and inside the darkness seemed different, thicker, heavier, like it was waiting. I crouched and leaned closer, trying to peer through the crack. At first, all I saw was black, but then something moved, a flicker, a shadow, too quick to be certain and yet undeniably there. I pulled back, my breath catching. Maybe it was just my reflection, distorted by the angle. Maybe it was the cabin playing tricks, or maybe it was. I couldn't tell anymore, and that uncertainty gnawed at me like hunger. The symbols on the door kept pulling my attention back. I traced them with my fingertip, feeling the grooves under my skin. They were smooth in places, rough in others, like they had been carved, sanded, and touched repeatedly over years. I tried to make sense of them. Was it a name, a warning, a ritual? I couldn't be sure, but I felt a strange recognition, as though my mind was being nudged towards something it already knew but didn't want to remember. I stepped away, trying to shake off the unease. The cabin seemed to breathe around me, the creaks and groans of the floorboards syncing with my heartbeat. I told myself it was just the woods settling, the forest pressing against the walls. But the moment I convinced myself of that, a soft sound came from behind the door. A scratching, faint, deliberate, not random. My skin prickled. I crouched again, listening. The sound stopped the moment I focused on it, then started again, further along the wall this time, almost like it was moving closer to me. I couldn't see anything, and yet I felt it. That tension, the sense of being watched, it pressed into my chest and made my lungs tight. I wanted to call out, to ask if someone was in there, but my voice caught, stubborn and useless, in my throat. I searched the rest of the cabin for clues, anything that could explain the door. Drawers, shelves, under furniture. I found scraps of paper, yellowed and brittle, with writing that didn't make sense at first glance. Lines of text crossed out repeatedly, notes about doors and voices, the woods, and something called the Watchers. I felt a chill. Whoever had been here had left these notes. Maybe hoping someone would read them, maybe warning them away. I wasn't sure which. Back at the door, I noticed another detail. Tiny scratches along the frame, like nails or claws had tried to escape from the other side. I swallowed hard. The scratches weren't deep enough to be violent, but their presence suggested movement, life, or something that mimicked it. My pulse rattled in my ears, and I had to step back. I thought about leaving, stepping out into the night and forgetting this cabin existed. But something anchored me here. Not curiosity alone, something deeper, a need to know. I crouched again, listening for anything, hearing only the soft hum of the forest through the cracked windows. And then faintly, almost impossibly, I heard a whisper. Not words, not yet. Just the sound of air moving, shaped like speech. My name, maybe. My mind raced. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, trying to convince myself I was alone. And yet, the more I tried to reassure myself, the more the cabin seemed alive with stories I didn't understand. The locked room was a heart beating somewhere inside these walls, and every creak, every shadow, every whisper was a pulse I couldn't ignore. I traced the symbols again, trying to memorize them, to understand them. Something about their pattern felt intentional, a puzzle left for me. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I thought I saw faint etchings inside the grooves, tiny faces, shapes almost human, twisted in ways I didn't want to see. I blinked. They were gone. But the impression remained, lingering in the corners of my vision, impossible to shake. I stepped back, leaning against the opposite wall, trying to catch my thoughts. The cabin had drawn me in, held me here, and I knew the locked room wasn't just a door. It was a threshold. Something behind it wanted attention, or maybe demanded it. My stomach knotted. I thought about the footprints outside, the faint smoke in the chimney, the stories etched into the walls. And then I realized something. Whatever had been behind this door before, it had been waiting a long time. And now, it had me. I sat down on the floor, lantern in hand, staring at the door. My hands trembled, but my curiosity refused to let go. I wondered if the symbols would speak to me eventually. I wondered if the whispers would become words. I wondered what the scratches meant, what had left them, and if it was still here. Each question opened another. Each answer I imagined only made the silence behind the door heavier. I didn't open it. Not yet. I didn't need to. The locked room had already claimed me in a way I couldn't explain. My eyes lingered on the door, the way the shadows pooled at its base, the way the light caught the carvings just so, making them seem alive. I could feel it watching me, patient, waiting, and I knew deep down that whatever lived in that room had known I would come, long before I even set foot in this cabin. Night settled heavier against the walls, the forest beyond growing darker, more oppressive. I could hear the wind, the trees bending, branches scratching the cabin like fingernails against wood. Somewhere behind the door there was movement, subtle but undeniable. I didn't need to see it to know it existed, and I didn't know if I wanted to. But I did want answers. I wanted to know what had been sealed away and why. I sat there, lantern glowing faintly, shadows stretching across the walls, tracing the edges of the room. I could almost hear the heartbeat of the cabin, the rhythm of something behind the locked door. And as the night deepened, I realized that waiting, watching, listening, this was part of the story too, part of the reason I was here. And no matter what came next, the locked room would not let me leave unchanged. The night pressed in closer than it had the first evening. Darkness didn't just fill the spaces outside the cabin, it seeped through the walls, through the cracks in the floor, wrapping around me like a living thing. I sat on the edge of the cot, lantern casting faint, trembling shadows, and listened. At first it was just the wind. The trees moaned and groaned as though they were shifting themselves, reaching out across the forest floor. But then I noticed it, a soft whisper just beyond the window, almost like a sigh. I froze, straining to hear, heart thudding too loud in my ears. It didn't make sense. There was no one out there. The nearest road was miles away, and the forest around the cabin was empty, or so I told myself. The whisper came again, faint, almost teasing, curling through the night air like smoke. I couldn't understand the words, if they were even words. My mind wanted to hear something familiar, some explanation. But the sound slipped past comprehension, a language I couldn't place, a tone both urgent and patient. I pressed my hand to the window, careful not to break the fragile silence. It was coming from the woods, maybe from behind the cabin, deeper in the trees. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind brushing against branches, leaves rubbing together. But the rhythm, the way it rose and fell, fading and returning, didn't belong to nature. It was deliberate, a call. Something was calling. I lit another candle, small and yellow, just to push back the dark and watch the edges of the cabin flicker. Shadows twisted, not in line with the lantern, but independent, almost like they were breathing. My stomach churned. I tried to focus on the floorboards beneath my feet, the walls, anything solid. But the whispers didn't stop. They circled the cabin, moving faster at times, lingering at the corners of the windows. I took a step toward the back door. My boots made no sound on the wooden floor, yet every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, as if the house itself was warning me. The whispers reacted. They sharpened, rising slightly, overlapping in a way that made me stagger back. My pulse raced, the hair on my arms stiff. What were they saying? My mind scrambled for meaning. Nothing stuck, only unease. I peered out into the dark, the forest a solid wall of black. Shadows moved between the trees, fleeting shapes that vanished the moment I blinked. I told myself it was animals, deer, foxes, birds roosting, but deep down I knew it was. The way the shadows responded to my movement almost purposefully was wrong, too intelligent, too aware. I retreated to the window by the main room. The whispering persisted, now sharper, closer. I could almost make out syllables, soft, almost human, but twisted. Each time I thought I recognized a sound, it dissolved into something else. I realized my pulse wasn't just in my chest anymore. I could feel it in my temples, in the tips of my fingers, in the backs of my knees. The cabin was vibrating with it, or maybe I was. I remembered the locked room, the sealed door at the end of the hall. The whispers seemed to originate from everywhere, yet somehow from that direction too. The symbols on the door replayed in my mind, grooves, scratches, and patterns that seemed alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lived behind that door had learned I was here, had been waiting for the night, and now it was speaking to me through the dark. I moved toward the hall, toward the room, but the whispers swirled faster. They weren't random. I could feel the cadence, almost like a pulse. And then, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. A different layer entered, faint and urgent. A single, almost human note piercing the indistinct murmurs. It made my chest tight. Something was trying to make me hear them, or warn me, or trap me. I stopped in the hallway. The cabin was alive now, breathing with me. Each creak of the floorboard, each groan of the walls seemed to echo the whispers. I wanted to flee, but my legs refused. I was glued to the moment, caught between curiosity and terror. I realized then that this place was feeding on attention, on fear. The longer I stayed, the stronger the pull became. I pulled the lantern closer, its light weak against the blackness beyond the walls. I tried to focus on the symbols again, tracing them in my mind. Maybe they were instructions, or warnings, or names. I didn't know. But something about them called to the whispers. And the whispers seemed to answer in kind, changing tone when I shifted focus, like a conversation I couldn't fully understand. I noticed movement again. Tiny, subtle at first, a swaying branch, a shadow stretching differently than it should. Then more definite, the flicker of something just beyond the clearing. A figure. My eyes strained to see, but the darkness swallowed it every time I tried. And still, the whispers continued, wrapping around the cabin, urgent but evasive, teasing understanding that never came. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my mind. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, a familiar scent now, but beneath it a metallic tang had returned. Blood, rust, memory, I couldn't tell, but it made me shiver. My fingers gripped the lantern tighter, knuckles white, the light dancing over walls, floor, ceiling. Shadows moved with a mind of their own, pulling my focus again and again. And then, just as I thought I might understand a pattern, a pause. The whispering stopped. Silence. Complete heavy silence. My chest ached from holding my breath. My ears strained. Nothing moved. I half expected the forest outside to collapse into quiet, but even the wind seemed muted, as if it was listening too. The lull lasted only moments, but it felt like hours. Then faintly a single whisper returned. This one distinct, clear, just enough to make my skin crawl. Inside, I spun, lantern raised, heart hammering. The hall behind me seemed longer than before, darker. The locked room stood at the end, silent and patient. I didn't move. I couldn't. But I knew. Whatever was out there, whatever had been whispering through the trees and the walls, it wanted me to go there. I wanted to resist. I wanted to step back into the safety of the main room. But the whispers, layered, persistent, alive, pulled me forward, a current I couldn't escape. Each step toward the locked room made them sharper, more insistent. I realized then that the cabin itself was orchestrating this, drawing me, testing me, preparing me for whatever lay behind that door. I crouched near the window, trying to gather thoughts, trying to steady my trembling hands. The forest outside was impossible to read, a living black sea, but the whispers gave me clues. Pauses, changes in tone, subtle shifts in volume. They were communicating, pointing, guiding. And I knew with a sinking certainty that if I ignored it, the whispers would become more aggressive, more demanding. A sudden draft swept the hallway, brushing past me. The lantern flickered violently. I almost dropped it, and for a moment I could swear I heard a laugh, or maybe a sigh, soft and deliberate, resonating from the locked door. My stomach twisted. Whoever or whatever was behind it, it wasn't sleeping. It had been waiting, and now it was awake. I forced myself to stand, lantern in hand, each step deliberate, each creak of the floorboards a drumbeat in the dark. The whispers had resumed, swirling around me, urgent now, almost coherent. My head spun with fragments, names, warnings, pleas. I couldn't piece them together, but their intent was clear. They wanted my attention. They wanted me to move, to see, to confront. The hall stretched before me. The door at the end waited. The whispers circled, teasing, patient, insistent. I didn't know what I would find if I opened it. I didn't know if I wanted to, but the night had claimed me. The forest had whispered me awake. The cabin had drawn me close, and the locked room, sealed and silent until now, had begun its conversation. I stopped just before the door, lantern raised, heart hammering, and whispered to myself, was I brave or foolish? The answer didn't matter. I could feel the pull, the inevitability, and somewhere deep, a small, quiet part of me thrilled at the possibility. The whispers shifted again. A new layer, a new voice, and my hand trembled over the knob. Whatever waited behind the door was alive, and it knew I had come. I woke before the sun fully touched the sky, the cabin still drenched in shadow, the kind that doesn't belong to the night or the day, but something in between. My eyes were heavy, my body stiff, and yet something had pulled me awake long before the light crept in. The air smelled different, colder, metallic, like old rain on stone. I swallowed, the taste bitter and dry, and realized the room felt wrong. The cot was empty where I had lain, though that alone didn't make sense. I had been there, hadn't I? My blanket was tossed aside, crumpled in a way that suggested someone, or something, had moved it. A shiver crawled up my spine. I sat up slowly, ears straining for any sound, but the only noises were the soft groans of the cabin settling and the whisper of wind outside. Or was that the wind? I leaned forward, lantern in hand, scanning the floor. There were marks, footprints, faint and almost too light to register. Bare feet, I thought, but the angles were wrong, the spacing irregular. Someone had been here, or something. My stomach turned. I remembered the whispers from last night, their urgent insistence, their elusive words. And now daylight showed me their handiwork, subtle but undeniable. The footprints led toward the hall, toward the locked room at the end. My fingers tightened around the lantern. Each step I took echoed too loudly, and yet the prints didn't match mine. They stopped abruptly at the door. No sign of them leaving, no trail beyond. It was as though whoever had been here had melted into the walls themselves. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I scanned the cabin for anything else out of place. The kitchen table was slightly askew, a chair tilted as though someone had leaned on it heavily. Dust on the floor had been disturbed in strange patterns, lines that curved like handwriting, like some language I didn't know. My throat tightened. This wasn't random. Whoever or whatever had been here wanted me to notice, wanted me to see that they had been present. And yet there was no trace of a human shape, no footprints leaving the cabin. I approached the window cautiously, peering out into the forest. Morning fog curled between the trees, softening the outlines of trunks and branches. The forest looked innocent, sleepy even, but the sense of being watched didn't fade with daylight. I felt the weight of unseen eyes, patient, waiting, and a small, cold part of me realized that the whispers hadn't stopped. They had only gone silent to bide their time. Back inside, the locked room pulled at me like a magnet. The symbols were more distinct in the morning light, grooves and scratches sharpened by the soft glow of dawn. I traced them with a trembling finger. The wood was rough under my skin, but there was a strange warmth to it, faint but unmistakable, as though the door itself had been breathing, or waiting. My mind raced with questions I didn't dare voice aloud. What had passed through here last night? What had left these traces? And why had it chosen now to reveal itself to me? I moved carefully through the cabin, lantern swaying slightly in my grip. The furniture seemed familiar, yet every corner held subtle distortions. A shadow that lingered too long, a shape that shifted when I blinked. I thought of the whispers, their persistent insistence, and realized that last night hadn't ended. They hadn't left. Daylight hadn't banished them. They had merely adapted, hiding in corners, in shapes, in sounds I hadn't noticed before. A sudden creak made me freeze. The sound came from the hallway near the locked door. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing, just the echoes of wood settling. But when I exhaled, I realized something had changed. The air was heavier here, dense, pressing against my chest. I imagined it was nothing, a trick of sleep deprivation, but instinct screamed otherwise. There was presence here, right now in this half-light, patient and unseen. I forced myself toward the kitchen, needing something solid to focus on, anything to anchor me. The table was as I had left it in the shadows of night, yet a cup had been moved, slightly rotated as if someone had examined it. Tiny scratches lined the rim, not deep but deliberate. I knelt to inspect them, stomach twisting. Whoever had been here had touched everything lightly, carefully, leaving a trail meant for me to find, yet leaving no body, no shadow, no explanation. I glanced at the floor again. The footprints led to the hallway and stopped at the door, but there were now faint scuff marks behind them, almost like nails dragging across the wood. I bent closer, heart pounding, and noticed something else. small flecks of dirt or ash, forming a path that spiraled slightly toward the corner where the morning light barely reached. I followed it with my eyes, and a chill ran down my spine. The path didn't lead outside, didn't lead anywhere visible. It simply ended, absorbed into the wall itself, leaving me staring at nothing. I realized I hadn't eaten. I hadn't touched anything since arriving. Hunger tugged at me, a mundane need in the midst of the unnatural. I grabbed a stale biscuit from the counter, chewing slowly, letting the taste anchor me. But even as I ate, my eyes never left the hallway. The locked room waited at the end, symbols carved deeper in daylight as if sharpened by the presence that had been here last night. And I felt it again, the pull, the insistence that I approach. The whispers were silent now, but the sensation remained. I could almost hear the echo of them in the morning, soft syllables layered beneath the sounds of the wind, a rhythm that mimicked my heartbeat. I pressed my hand to the wall, tracing the grain, feeling the faint vibrations of something alive on the other side of the locked door. I didn't know whether to knock, to open it, or to run. And yet, some part of me wanted to open it desperately, as though understanding would bring relief. I noticed the shadows shift with the sunrise. They stretched unnaturally along the walls, shapes bending, curling, forming almost recognizable outlines. Faces, limbs, I couldn't tell. The cabin seemed larger now, halls longer, corners darker. The morning had revealed not clarity, but more questions. I realized then that whatever had been in the cabin overnight wasn't done with me. Daylight had not driven it away. It had only shown me more of what it could do, more of the space it claimed. I returned to the cot, hands trembling slightly, and sat. The morning sun filtered through the small windows, casting pale gray light that barely touched the edges of the room. I counted shadows, shapes, subtle disturbances in the dust. Each one seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it, each one whispering a secret I couldn't grasp. And I knew with a deep, sinking certainty that the traces I had found were warnings, or invitations. I couldn't decide which. A breeze brushed through the broken windows, carrying with it a faint metallic tang, the same scent from last night. My stomach nodded. It was real. Someone or something had been here, and it had left evidence, deliberate and haunting, for me to find. The forest beyond was silent now, peaceful in the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching, waiting, and that it had agents inside this cabin. I approached the locked door again, lantern raised, noticing details I hadn't before. Tiny scratches at the base, faint fingerprints in the dust on the frame, grooves in the wood deepened by the touch of unseen hands. The symbols seemed almost to shimmer in the weak morning light, alive, as though anticipating my next move. I felt drawn, pulled forward, aware that stepping closer was a choice that might change everything. And then I noticed the last trace, something I hadn't seen until the light hit it just right. A small, irregular impression in the floorboards, faint but unmistakable. A shape too human to be random, too precise to be accidental. It looked almost like a body had been pressed there or crouched, waiting, observing. My breath caught. I realized I had been alone all night, or so I had thought. But now the evidence suggested otherwise. Someone or something had been here, breathing, moving, watching. I stepped back, heart hammering, hands gripping the lantern. The traces, the footprints, the scratches, the impressions, they were all real. The cabin had held secrets last night, shadows that didn't vanish with dawn. And though I could not see it now, I felt it somewhere in the corners, in the walls, in the air between me and the locked room. Patient, watching, waiting. The morning light did not comfort me. It only revealed more. The cabin had been alive overnight, and whatever had passed through left marks I could not ignore. I understood then, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that the danger had not ended with the night. It lingered, insidious and unseen, and it had chosen me. And as I stared at the locked door once more, tracing the symbols, noticing the subtle distortions in the wood, I realized that the traces I had found were only the beginning. Something waited behind that door. Something that had moved through this cabin in the shadows of night and now watched, patient, as morning revealed the world outside. And I could feel it whispering still, though I could not hear the words, "Come closer." I came to the clearing before the sun had fully broken over the ridge, the fog still thick and heavy, curling between the skeletal trees like smoke that refused to rise. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth, and I paused, trying to catch the faintest signs of movement. The air smelled of wet pine and rot, a strange combination that made my stomach twist. I had been hiking these trails for years, but this section, something felt off. That's when I saw them: footprints. At first I thought they were just deer tracks, shallow impressions in the mud, fading as they led toward the old logging cabin I'd read about in passing. But the spacing was wrong, too human, too deliberate. And yet the prints were odd: the toes too long, the heels too narrow. I knelt, brushing away a patch of fog with my hand, and traced the outline with a trembling finger. Whoever or whatever made these had come through here recently. I swallowed hard, the fog wrapping around me like a cold hand. The cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, half collapsed, its roof sagging and walls blackened with age. Windows were broken, boards warped and splintered, but something about it drew me forward. Not curiosity entirely. Fear had a magnetism of its own, and it pulled me through the mist. As I approached, I noticed more subtle signs. Bent branches along the trail, scratches in the bark as though someone or something had brushed against the trees. The footprints were interspersed with depressions that didn't match human gait, some deeper, some oddly twisted, as if the ground itself had been disturbed by weight I couldn't account for. My pulse quickened. Stories of missing hikers in the area flickered through my mind, half-forgotten warnings and local rumors, but I pushed them aside. I had to see the cabin, had to know what left these marks. The fog seemed to thicken around me, muffling the sound of my steps. Every crack of a branch underfoot echoed too loudly. The footprints led to the front of the cabin, stopping at the threshold. Dust and debris had shifted inside, forming vague patterns in the dim light that filtered through broken boards. I hesitated at the doorway, heart hammering, but something inside compelled me to step over the threshold. Inside, the cabin was dark, the remnants of its past clinging to the air like stale smoke. A broken chair lay on its side, a faded coat draped across a beam. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I felt a faint chill along my spine. My eyes swept over the room, noting the small, incongruous details. A child's shoe wedged under the table, a rusted tin with a cracked lid, the smell of something old and iron-tinged. It was as if the cabin had been frozen mid-life, abandoned suddenly. Then I saw them again, footprints. They crossed the floor, leading to the corner of the cabin where light barely touched. Unlike the ones outside, these were faint, almost fading into the dust, and yet they were unmistakably human. I bent to examine them, noting the size, the stride, the uneven pressure. And there was more small, irregular marks that didn't belong, shallow depressions that suggested someone, or something, had crawled or been dragged. My stomach knotted and I stepped back, the air thick with tension. I remembered the stories I'd heard from hikers who came this way before. People vanishing without a trace, sometimes leaving only footprints that seemed to appear and disappear at random, leading to the forest and never out again. Some claimed the woods themselves were alive, shifting paths, creating illusions. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself it was just a story, but the prints at my feet argued otherwise. This was real, tangible, and recently made. A faint breeze stirred, rattling the broken boards, and I froze. It wasn't the wind I heard. It was a whisper, soft, indecipherable, like a voice carried from somewhere deep within the fog. I couldn't make out the words if there were any. Just syllables and breath, twisting and curling around my mind. My pulse jumped. The footprints seemed to twitch, almost imperceptibly, under my gaze, as though aware I had noticed them. I followed the trail inside the cabin, moving carefully over the uneven floorboards. The air smelled colder now, more metallic. My fingers brushed against the walls for balance, and I felt the texture of splintered wood, smooth in some places, rough in others. Something was watching, I knew it. Not with eyes, but with presence, patient and silent. I couldn't see it, yet I felt it, pressing in from the corners, from the fog outside, waiting. The trail led me toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow doorway opened onto a small room, dark and half-collapsed. The footprints ended abruptly there, stopping at the threshold. I stepped closer, lantern held high, and saw more marks in the dust, small, circular depressions like someone had knelt, paused, or crouched. And then the smell hit me, a faint, coppery tang like dried blood mingled with wet earth. I gagged slightly, the air heavy and oppressive. I wanted to turn back to leave, but curiosity held me rooted. I leaned over the threshold, peering into the dark interior. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and shifting, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a flicker at the edge of my vision, but when I blinked, nothing remained. The room was empty, yet every instinct screamed that it was not. The footprints outside, the disturbances here, the faint whispers in the air, they were all connected. Something had been here, something that left traces yet refused to show itself. I noticed the walls of the room, blackened with soot and scratched with strange, shallow lines. The patterns didn't make sense at first, but the longer I stared, the more I realized they were deliberate, almost like a language I didn't know. Some of the scratches formed shapes, loops, arcs, and dots that felt both primitive and sinister. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch them, fearing and needing to know what they meant. My fingers passed over the grooves, tracing shapes I couldn't understand, but the sensation was electric, sending a jolt of fear deep into my chest. Outside, the fog thickened again, pressing against the cabin like a living thing. The trees swayed slightly, creaking and groaning as if murmuring to one another. The footprints, though silent now, had left a path that threaded through the clearing, back toward the woods, and I knew, without needing to see, that the trail extended far beyond the cabin, twisting and turning into the depths where others had vanished, never to be seen again. A sudden thought struck me. What if the stories were true? What if the missing hikers, the whispers in the forest, the half-remembered warnings, they were all pieces of the same pattern? My chest tightened and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. The cabin wasn't abandoned in the way I had thought. It was waiting, watching, protecting something, or perhaps something had protected it. I didn't know which, but the evidence was all around me. I stepped back into the main room, eyes scanning every corner. The fog outside had not lifted. It had thickened, rolling in waves through the broken windows. The footprints, the whispers, the scratches, they were all there, lingering, teasing me. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had become part of the pattern. The forest had drawn me here, and now I couldn't leave without facing what had left these traces. And then I heard it clearly, a soft shuffle from the far end of the cabin just beyond the threshold I had considered entering. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. The sound repeated, hesitant, careful, as if whatever had made it was testing me, gauging my reaction. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady, telling myself it was just a trick of the fog, the wind, the creaking timber. But deep down, I knew better. The footprints outside, the markings inside, the whispers I had almost missed, they were not random. They were messages, warnings, invitations, and I had answered by stepping into the cabin. The fog swirled thicker now, curling under the door frames, over the floor, moving like breath. I could feel the weight of it, heavy and insistent, pressing against me, urging me to go further. I glanced at the doorway to the small room again, the air beyond seeming darker, almost solid. I knew the footprints ended there for a reason. Whatever had made them had paused, waited, left its mark, and then vanished. Now it was my turn. The trail continued only if I chose to follow it, and the fear and curiosity inside me warred violently. But the hiker in me, the part that had trekked miles through rain, mud, and cold, pushed forward. I stepped toward the small room, feeling the first real brush of dread settle into my bones. The fog outside twisted like smoke through the trees, shadows stretching and bending with unnatural angles. I took another breath, the metallic tang stronger now, and crossed the threshold. The footprints were gone, replaced by shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of sight. And then I realized the forest wasn't waiting outside anymore. It was inside the cabin with me, and I had no idea how to leave. I found it lying in the corner, half buried under a pile of damp leaves and splintered floorboards. At first glance, it looked like any other old notebook, its cover warped, edges curled, leather cracked. But something about it made the hairs on my arms rise. I picked it up carefully, brushing off the dirt, and noticed the faint smell of mold mixed with iron, like the air itself had absorbed old fear. The pages were yellowed, fragile, whispering with every movement as if they resented being disturbed. I opened it slowly, the binding protesting with a soft crack, and a loose page fell to the floor. The handwriting inside was neat but strangely inconsistent, letters looping and curling in ways that made them almost illegible. I could feel the tension radiating from the words before I even read them, a cold pulse that set my nerves on edge. Day, I can't tell anyone. They said I should stay. I stayed, but they wait. The ink was smudged in places, water-stained or perhaps rubbed by trembling hands. My finger traced the letters, trying to understand who wrote this and why. The sentence alone made my heart pound. The ambiguity gnawed at me. Who were they? What had they said? I turned the page. More fragments, short sentences, broken thoughts. I hear whispers when I sleep. Not voices I know, not yet, but close. The words echoed in my mind as though they were spoken aloud in the cabin itself. I paused, listening. Outside, the wind rattled the broken windows, but inside it felt heavier, almost impatient. I had the uncanny feeling that the diary's author was still here, watching me read, waiting for me to understand. Another page. Footprints in the fog. I followed them. Too many. Not human. I should not have gone, but I did. My pulse quickened. I remembered the tracks I had seen before I even entered the cabin. The connection was immediate, visceral. The diary was a map of fear, and I was tracing the same route as someone who had vanished long before me. The words bled anxiety, a tangible dread that wrapped around my chest. The pages became increasingly fragmented, lines scribbled over themselves, letters overlapping, desperate. They know. I hear them at night, breathing close to me. Not in the cabin, not in the woods, but in the spaces between. I can't. The sentence ended abruptly, a sharp vertical tear cutting through the page. I pressed my palm against the words, sensing the panic and abruptness of someone cut off mid-thought, someone silenced. I couldn't help but imagine the author, hunched over these pages, hand trembling, eyes darting toward the corners of the cabin, toward the windows, the dark forest beyond. The forest outside had always seemed passive, quiet, empty, but the diary painted it differently. It was patient, deliberate, waiting, and it had claimed the author. A shift in the air made me look up. Shadows pooled in the corners, the ones the morning had promised to disperse, still there, heavier than they should be. The fog that had crept through the broken windows in the night seemed to cling to the edges of the room, curling around furniture and floorboards like a living thing. I forced myself to breathe, opening another page. Voices call my name, sometimes mine, sometimes not. I see footprints leading from the cabin to nowhere. I cannot follow, cannot stay, cannot leave. They wait for the wrong thing, the wrong person, maybe me. The words blurred as my stomach twisted. The diary's author had been trapped in a cycle, caught between choices that led nowhere safe. My own footsteps, the prints outside, suddenly felt like echoes of theirs, like I was walking the same path. I noticed a faint line drawn at the bottom of the page. It was not a margin. It curved and twisted, almost like a path through the woods. I leaned closer, heart thudding. It was a trail, or maybe a map. My hand hovered over it, hesitant to touch what could be a literal invitation or a warning. The ink was thick in places, smeared in others, as if whoever had drawn it had been interrupted. A sudden creak of the cabin floor startled me, though I was alone. I told myself it was nothing, wind or rotten timber, but the feeling persisted, heavy, pressing, like the diary itself was warning me. Beware the footprints, beware the forest, beware yourself. I turned another page, desperate to find an explanation, something tangible to cling to. The forest breathes with memories. Some vanish, some stay, trapped in the fog. I saw them. Faces in the mist, eyes following. No one saw me. I am alone. They come closer at night. I can't hear them, but I know. My chest tightened. I had walked through the mist this morning and felt eyes, felt the weight of observation that made the hairs on my neck prickle. Now I understood. The diary didn't just record events, it predicted them, transferred the tension from the author to me. Another page revealed a date scrawled in uneven ink, partially smudged. Months had passed, perhaps years, I couldn't tell. The handwriting became more erratic, scrawls overlapping, sentences trailing off. I follow the fog. They do not follow me. Or do they? I hear whispers, not words, sounds like the scraping of nails against bark, breathing exhaled into my ears. I see shapes fleeting, bending in the mist. I think it knows I am reading. It knows. The words hit me like a weight in my stomach. I realized then that the diary was not just a story, it was a record of obsession, of someone slowly unraveling in the forest's embrace. I could feel the tension they had felt, the creeping awareness of being watched, the paranoia that gnawed at their mind. And the footprints outside, my footprints now in a sense, connected me to the same web. I tried to pause, to breathe, to anchor myself in logic. But the diary had a momentum of its own. I flipped another page. I cannot leave, they wait, the cabin waits, I wait. Fog moves differently when someone is near. They see me when I cannot, I smell them before I hear them. Footsteps, soft, careful, circling. I do not move, I am still. I pray they do not find me. I pray. The sentence ended in a smear, ink spreading into the fibers of the paper, like tears that could not be contained. A sound made me glance toward the window. Just outside, the fog shifted again, curling unnaturally. I thought I saw a figure there, tall, indistinct, moving without breaking the mist. I blinked and it was gone. My hand clutched the diary tighter, pages trembling as though my own heartbeat had infused it with motion. The forest had always been there, quiet, patient. Now it felt alive in a way that mirrored the diary itself. I realized that the fragments of writing were all I had. No explanation, no resolution, just glimpses of terror and isolation. And yet the diary compelled me to continue reading, to know more. Each page whispered a question I had to answer. Who were they? Who or what had waited? And what became of them in the fog? The last page I read had nothing but a single word, scrawled in heavy ink, jagged, like a warning shouted silently. Follow. My stomach sank. It could be a command, a plea, or simply the residue of madness. I could not tell. And yet the instinct to obey, to continue, was almost unbearable. The fog outside pressed against the cabin again, a slow, curling wave, and I knew the footprints still led somewhere deeper into the forest, beyond understanding, beyond safety. I closed the diary, but the words lingered. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the fog, every half-glimpsed shadow seemed tied to them now, to the author, to the forest itself. I felt the presence again, not human, not fully visible, but aware, watching me, waiting for my next step. The diary had connected me to it. It had drawn me into the same pattern. And somewhere in the fog, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I felt it breathe. I stepped out of the cabin before the sun fully touched the sky. The fog hadn't lifted. It hung thick between the trees, damp and suffocating, mooting the world into shades of gray. Each footstep on the soft, mossy ground felt heavier than the last, as if the forest were weighing me down, testing my resolve. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just morning chill, just old leaves and rotting wood, but a prickle at the back of my neck said otherwise. The trees leaned in closer than they should, trunks gnarled like hands grasping at the fog. I had been here before, of course, but in daylight the forest seemed alive in a different way. Now it felt aware. I noticed small things at first, a snapped branch too precise to be an accident, the faint indentation of a foot pressed into mud that was long dried. I crouched, tracing it with my finger, heart hammering. These weren't mine. They weren't anyone I'd seen come or go from this place. And yet the trail seemed to follow me. The diary came to mind, tucked under my arm. Its pages whispered half-remembered fragments of fear, footprints in the fog, faces in the mist. I had read them as warnings, but now, moving through the forest, they felt like a map, a guide I hadn't wanted. The fog seemed thicker where I paused, curling around my ankles, rising in slow, deliberate waves, and I realized I could barely see more than 10 feet ahead. A sound startled me, a faint rustling like clothing brushing against leaves. I froze, straining, listening. There was nothing visible, but the directionless movement made my stomach twist. Then I heard it again, and this time it was slower, deliberate, circling me. Not a human step, not entirely. Something else, something patient. I pressed on, trying to keep my nerves in check. The forest opened in patches, thin light slicing through the fog, revealing fallen logs and tangled roots. And there, scrawled on the bark of one of the older trees, were marks I couldn't read. Symbols, scratches deep and jagged, chaotic but intentional. I stepped closer, touching them, and a chill ran through me. They felt familiar, almost like the lines drawn in the diary, warnings left behind, or instructions, perhaps. Footsteps, or what I thought were footsteps, appeared again. Behind me, ahead, maybe to my left. The fog played tricks, bending light, shaping shadows. I tried to rationalize it. I was tired, yes. I had spent nights awake in the cabin, reading a diary that might have been written by someone already lost to this place. But rational thought offered little comfort. The forest seemed to hum with quiet menace. Every rustle, every whisper of wind through the branches felt like words just beyond comprehension. I stumbled upon a clearing, small, circular, almost unnatural in shape. The ground was bare, scraped clean, as if nothing had been allowed to grow there for years. And then I saw them, footprints, hundreds of them pressed deep into the soil, all leading inwards toward a central point. I counted a few, my mind racing. These weren't human, not all of them. Some were long, narrow, clawed. Others oddly small, almost childlike, but impossibly spaced. I felt my pulse spike, the urge to turn and run pressing against every rational thought. I wanted to leave, but my feet refused. The forest had a grip, a silent insistence. It was as if it wanted me here, wanted me to see this. And then I noticed something else, a pattern. The prints formed a spiral leading inward like a trap. My breath fogged in the chill air. The diary's words echoed. They follow when you look away, footprints in the fog. I should not have gone. I shivered. I had gone, and now I was here. I walked carefully around the edges of the clearing, eyes darting to every shadow. The fog thickened suddenly, an invisible wall pressing against my face. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, uneven. And then the whisper came, not human, not full words, but a sound that pricked my consciousness. Soft, lingering, almost melodic, just on the edge of hearing. I froze. I couldn't locate it. It seemed to circle me, rising and falling with the fog, a voice that wasn't really a voice, pulling me forward. I followed it against every instinct, deeper into the trees. Branches clawed at my clothing, at my skin, but I didn't stop. My eyes caught movement at the edge of the fog, shapes bending, retreating when I tried to focus. Faces, or imagined faces, I couldn't tell. The diary had warned me about seeing things in the mist, things that weren't there unless you wanted them to be. But my body and mind were both screaming that they were real, that someone or something was here. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The forest had a way of stretching time, compressing it into a relentless, oppressive pressure. I stumbled over roots, fell onto damp leaves, yet the footprints continued, spiraling around me, growing more erratic, like a reflection of the forest's mood. I could feel it judging me, guiding me, daring me to see what lay at the center. And then I reached it. A second clearing, smaller, more intimate, encircled by older, twisted trees. The ground was bare, and in the center the earth had been scraped clean, darker than the soil around it, almost black in the low light. The footprints converged here, pressed deep, and I realized they had formed a kind of circle enclosing this spot. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and noticed small fragments embedded in the dirt, shards of bone. I knelt, the fog swirling around me, and felt bile rise in my throat. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but something held me there. And then the whispers returned, louder now, urgent, circling, impossible to locate. The sound pressed into my mind, a pulse that I couldn't shake. They wait, they see, they know. I knew. I felt the weight of everyone who had vanished in these woods, a collective presence pressing against me. The diary, the footprints, the whispers, they weren't warnings. They were invitations or traps. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, landing hard on damp earth. My hands scrabbled at the fog, at the leaves, at anything to anchor myself. The whispers seemed to converge, tightening around me, urging me, daring me. And in that instant, I understood the forest was alive, not with animals, not with wind, but with something patient, eternal, and very old. It had seen everything, claimed everything, and now I was a part of its story. The diary in my pocket burned against my leg as if echoing my panic. I remembered the author, vanished, left behind only scraps of terror. The spiral of footprints, the whispers, the fog, all leading to nowhere safe. I couldn't retrace my steps. The trees shifted subtly, rearranging, or perhaps my mind bending. Either way, I was lost. And then faintly in the distance, a sound, a branch snapping, a footfall. I turned toward it, but the fog swallowed everything. My own steps sounded alien in this place, echoing impossibly. The forest moved around me, and I understood that leaving was not a simple act. Not here, not ever. I sank to my knees, exhausted, trying to breathe, to think. And then I noticed the small details, a set of footprints parallel to mine, slightly behind. Not human, not entirely. Watching me, waiting. I felt the weight of the missing, the vanished, the forgotten. Their presence was subtle, patient, a reminder that the forest never let go. I stayed there, pressed against a tree, as the fog thickened and the whispers circled. I didn't move, didn't dare, and yet I knew the forest had already decided my place. I was part of its history now, another presence threading itself into the fog, into the footprints, into the diary's warnings that I had read and ignored. And somewhere just beyond the twisted trees and curling mist, I could feel them, the watchers, the patient, the eternal eyes, waiting. I parked the truck at the edge of the forest, where the road narrowed into dirt tracks and the trees leaned close, blocking the morning light. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, they said, left behind after something terrible happened here. Nobody went near it anymore except me. That was my job, caretaker, official in title, reluctant in practice. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I believed in silence, and this place had a way of pressing on it until it felt solid, like a weight I could touch. The path to the cabin was choked with roots and fallen branches. I stepped carefully, boots sinking slightly into damp soil, the smell of moss and decay thick in the air. A low mist hugged the forest floor, curling around tree trunks, slipping between the broken branches. I could hear the distant river, steady and indifferent, but closer than that were the sounds of life I didn't recognize. Small twigs snapping, leaves shifting, but no birds, no insects, just the forest breathing. When I reached the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. That shouldn't have surprised me. I'd been warned it was in bad shape, but I still froze just for a second, imagining someone had beaten me to it. Inside, the air was cold and dry, stale like old paper, thick with dust motes floating in shafts of muted light. Every surface was coated with a gray hush, and the smell of old smoke lingered, faint but unmistakable. I set down my bag and ran a hand along the edge of the door frame. Splintered wood, rough, uneven, like the cabin itself had been clawed at by time. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved, and each creak echoed too loudly, like a warning I didn't want to hear. I tried to focus on routine, check the windows, sweep off leaves, make sure no animals had taken shelter. But my attention kept wandering, drawn to the far corner where the shadows pooled thickest. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, yes, but it had history. Local gossip, a few dusty articles in the town library. They spoke of a family that disappeared one night, leaving everything behind, their last known steps ending here. They never found them, never explained why. And now, here I was, standing in the same room, listening to the quiet, wondering if I'd step into the same kind of silence that swallowed them whole. I tried to settle in, unpacking the small supplies I brought when I noticed it. A scratch, shallow but deliberate, along the inside of the door jamb. At first I thought a raccoon had done it, but it was vertical, measured, repeated in small intervals, almost like marks left to count days. My stomach tightened. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just time playing tricks, but the marks made the room feel smaller, like it was watching me back. I moved deeper, checking the fireplace. The ash was old, undisturbed, but among the debris I noticed something small, dark, hidden under a corner stone. I reached down and picked it up, a key blackened with rust, its shape awkward and unfamiliar. I turned it over in my hand. Why would a key be left here alone in a cabin abandoned for decades? It wasn't attached to anything, not to a drawer or chest, not even to the door I'd entered. The air shifted suddenly, cooler, heavier. I paused, hand on the key, and listened. There was a sound, almost imperceptible at first, a soft shuffle like fabric brushing against floorboards, but I was alone. I told myself it was the wind, a branch outside, anything but what I feared. Yet my pulse betrayed me, hammering in my ears louder than the faint thud of my own steps. I set the key down, tried to focus, and in that moment I felt it. The cabin had a memory, and it wasn't kind. I checked the corners, lifted floorboards, peered under the shelves. Everything was empty, or almost everything. A small diary lay on the shelf, edges frayed, pages brittle. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and half of it faded beyond recognition. Names, dates, cryptic sentences. They watch when you don't see, don't follow the sound, never sleep. My fingers trembled. The diary was decades old, yet the fear in those words felt fresh, immediate. I tried to rationalize it. A child, perhaps, or someone keeping notes of their fears. But the diary ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted, vanished mid-thought. That interruption made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I closed it slowly, letting it rest against the shelf. There was a moment of relief, brief and hollow. I tried to breathe normally, tried to remind myself that I was here for work, for maintenance, not for superstition. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost swallowed by the cabin's dust, barely there. I froze. My head snapped toward the window, toward the shadows pooling in the corners. Nothing moved. I told myself I imagined it. The house groaned. The whisper came again, just a fraction louder, like someone breathing my name from the hallway I hadn't entered. I gripped the key again, feeling its weight, its promise of secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to unlock. My flashlight cut across the room, dust motes dancing like tiny spirits in the beam. In the corner, I noticed a series of scratches, etched into the wooden wall, deeper this time, almost deliberate, vertical, spaced, repeating. A language of fear. My pulse thundered. The cabin had stories, yes, but it also had patience. It waited, and I was here alone. I moved toward the fireplace again, convinced myself to check one last corner when the floor creaked differently. Behind me, or perhaps in front, I couldn't tell. The whispers rose, soft but insistent, circling, teasing comprehension that never arrived. My heart raced. The diary's words returned, echoing in my head. Don't follow the sound. But I was already listening, caught between curiosity and dread. The cabin seemed to breathe around me, each shadow stretching just a fraction too long. The key in my hand felt heavier, as though it knew more than I did, as though it had been waiting for me to arrive. I noticed, for the first time, a small door, almost hidden beneath a low shelf. It wasn't locked, not physically, but the air around it was colder, denser, a kind of warning that prickled across my skin. I crouched and peered inside. Darkness swallowed the space, deeper than it should be, almost unnaturally so. I could hear the faint drip of water, the scrape of wood settling, but also beneath it something else. A soft shuffle, a breath. The whispers, now almost a chant, curling around my ears. I wanted to step back, to run, but my curiosity was a tether stronger than my fear. I closed the small door gently, retreating a step. My flashlight flickered. For a moment I thought I saw something move at the edge of its beam, a shadow or a trick of the old wood. My mind screamed at me to leave, to forget the key, the diary, the small hidden door. But the cabin had already claimed a piece of me, a whisper of attention, a sliver of obedience to its unspoken rules. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The whispers receded slightly, leaving only the low groan of the cabin, the occasional crack of timber, the sigh of wind pressed against the broken windows. But I knew they were still there, patient, persistent, waiting. And I knew, too, that my check-in wasn't simple maintenance. It was a first step into something much older, something that the diary had only hinted at, something that the cabin had been waiting decades to reveal. As the light grew dimmer and shadows stretched, I realized the forest beyond the windows was watching, listening. Footsteps long gone, voices long vanished, all threading themselves into this small space, shaping it, bending it. I was the newest part, the latest observer in a line I couldn't trace. And I knew that tomorrow, when I returned, the cabin would have changed again, even if nothing outside had moved. And in the dark I felt it, a presence, patient, waiting, unseen but palpable. Not threatening, not yet, but insistent. And the diary's final line whispered in my memory, "They are patient. You are next." I thought the cabin would feel empty in the daytime, harmless under sunlight, but even with the pale light spilling through the broken windows, it felt alive. Not in the way a house feels alive, warm or welcoming, but alive in the way a wound remembers pain. I stepped inside, boots crunching over loose shards of wood, and the smell hit me first. Old smoke, damp rot, and something sour beneath it, like stale fear that had been left to fester. The floorboards groaned with every step. At first I chalked it up to old wood, but then I noticed the pattern, creaks that shouldn't have been there. Uneven, irregular. Sometimes it sounded like someone was packing in another room, circling, deliberate. I froze, listening, and my own heartbeat seemed too loud, too intrusive in the silence. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises. But the more I walked, the more certain I became that some of these sounds weren't natural. A chair, just a simple wooden chair, shifted slightly as I passed. Not toppled, not moved by wind, just shifted a fraction like it had been nudged. I caught my reflection in a cracked window. My eyes looked normal, my face pale but fine. But for a second the reflection seemed off, delayed almost. Watching. I blinked and it was fine. Normal, just me. I tried to focus, to stick to the routine I came for. Inspect the walls, check the windows, clear debris, make notes. But even the act of writing felt strange. The pen moved stiffly, the notebook resisting as if aware of what I was trying to record. Outside, the forest whispered, though nothing should have been moving. Leaves rustled, yes, but not in the wind's rhythm. There was a pulse to it, irregular, almost like the forest itself was breathing slowly, deliberately. I found myself at the fireplace again. The last time I'd been here, it had seemed inert, dead. But now the hearth felt tense, like it remembered. Ashes shifted slightly as if settling from some recent disturbance. I knelt down and blew lightly across the pile, half expecting something to spring out at me, but nothing appeared. Still, the air felt tighter, charged. The diary I'd found yesterday lay on a nearby shelf, closed. I reached for it instinctively, flipping it open to a random page. Words I couldn't recall reading before stared up at me, jagged. They wait in stillness. Every shadow counts. A noise behind me, soft but sharp, made me spin. Nothing. Just the cabin, just dust motes drifting in slanting light. But the moment stretched, long and uneven, like time itself was lagging around the edges of the room. I felt watched. I always felt watched in here, but the sensation had sharpened. It wasn't an abstract unease anymore, it was physical. The air pressed on me. The walls leaned in, subtle, almost imperceptible. I stood and moved toward the kitchen corner. A tin cup rattled softly on the shelf. No wind, no vibration, just the cup, trembling like it was responding to my heartbeat. I leaned closer, expecting some hidden animal. Nothing. The cupboard door, slightly ajar, moved just enough to make a whisper of noise. I stepped back. The house's silence had a rhythm now, like a pulse, and I was part of it whether I wanted to be or not. In the corner, I noticed scratches along the wall, deeper than yesterday. Vertical, spaced in patterns. Not random, not childish, intentional. Accounting. I crouched, tracing them with a fingertip. The grooves were old, decades old, but fresh dust had settled inside them unevenly, disturbed as if someone or something had brushed against them recently. My stomach knotted. I tried to leave, to step outside, but the cabin had other ideas. The door groaned as I moved toward it, resisting. The key from the previous day, still in my pocket, felt heavier, like it had absorbed the room's tension. I pulled it out, running a finger along the rusted metal, and the movement triggered a subtle shift. A floorboard behind me groaned, again out of pattern. Something moved in the far corner. Not visible. Just there, a presence that distorted the air slightly, shimmered at the edge of vision. I told myself it was imagination, stress, fatigue. But the cabin didn't allow imagination. It demanded attention. Every creak, every whisper of motion, every subtle shift of objects was an argument. Watch, notice, remember. The diary's warnings echoed. Don't ignore the small movements, they are speaking. I wanted to understand, but understanding brought discomfort. I realized then that the house didn't just contain history, it repeated it, practiced it, and observed. I moved to the far window, looking out at the forest. Mist hung low, curling around the base of the trees. Branches moved in patterns I didn't recognize. Something seemed to flit through the undergrowth, always just at the edge of perception. I squinted and it vanished, but the feeling remained. Presence without form, watching without revealing itself. I went back to the diary, flipping through more pages. More fragmented entries, partial thoughts, half sentences ending abruptly. Names, dates, cryptic phrases. The handwriting changed, sometimes shaky, sometimes tight and controlled. They listen when you speak. The walls hear, the floorboards move when we're not looking. My hands shook. Every word confirmed what I was seeing. The house wasn't inert. It recorded, reacted, and perhaps remembered everything that had ever happened within it. Another noise. A soft tap like fingernails on wood. I froze. Not outside, not upstairs, behind me. I slowly turned. Nothing moved. My breath came in shallow bursts. The diary trembled slightly in my hands, though I had set it down on a solid shelf. The cup I'd left earlier rattled again, once, twice. Something shifted in the room's shape almost imperceptibly. I felt smaller, vulnerable, exposed. I needed a break, some physical reassurance that the house was just a building. I stepped outside, sunlight striking my face, warmth brushing the tension from my bones. For a moment, relief. The forest outside looked ordinary, still, patient. But the cabin didn't stop. The soft groaning of floorboards continued, though I was outside. The whispers of past movements, echoes of actions, stretched beyond its walls. Even in daylight, the house reached. I stayed near the truck, listening. Each creak and scratch inside the cabin had a meaning, a memory I couldn't yet read. The diary's warnings weren't just words, they were instructions, or perhaps maps, for navigating something I didn't understand. The weight of it pressed on me. The key, still in my pocket, reminded me of doors I hadn't opened, places I hadn't explored. And I knew, even as the sunlight warmed my skin, that the cabin's history was patient, waiting for me to return. As I stepped back inside, the air felt different. Lighter but tense, expectant. Every object seemed to vibrate softly in rhythm with something deep and hidden. The creaks became language, the whispers patterns, the scratches punctuation. I realized that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts alone. It was haunted by its own memory, and I was now part of it. Part of the story it had been waiting decades to tell. And then I heard it again. Faint, almost drowned by daylight, a whisper that was almost a chant. Not words I recognized, but a tone, an insistence. It circled, subtle and deliberate, coaxing my attention toward the corner, toward the diary, toward the key. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. The echoes of past violence, subtle yet undeniable, were still here. They were patient, persistent, and I had returned to listen. I placed the diary back on the shelf. The key returned to my pocket. The cup stopped moving. For a moment the cabin seemed to settle, but only slightly. I knew the stillness was temporary, a pause, a breath between repetitions. The faint echoes of movement, whispers, and past presence would resume. They always did. And I knew even now that my next step, my next decision, would bring me deeper into the cabin's memory, deeper into the rhythm I could no longer ignore. I stepped back toward the center of the room. The light shifted, dust motes dancing in patterns that weren't random. The floorboards held their shape, but their creaks were closer, sharper, deliberate. I realized the house had noticed me fully now. It remembered me. And as the faint echoes of past movements circled the room, patient and insistent, I understood something that both terrified and fascinated me. The cabin didn't just hold history. It held attention. And my attention was now a part of it. I didn't notice it at first. The slight shift in the floorboards, the way one plank seemed just a fraction higher than the others. My boots made it creak under my weight, and I stopped, listening. The cabin was quiet now, deceptively quiet, like it was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a corner of paper peeking from beneath the edge of the wood. I knelt, fingers trembling slightly, and slid it free. The note was yellowed, brittle at the edges, handwritten in jagged, looping letters. One word at the top, sorry. Nothing else, just that. My stomach tightened. Why hide a note under the floor, and why sorry? I lifted another plank, heart hammering. There were more notes, tucked like secrets, some folded, some torn. Each had a single phrase, don't trust him. They will come for what is theirs. It wasn't supposed to end this way. My fingers shook as I sorted them in order, trying to make sense. The handwriting changed from page to page, but the words all pointed to one thing, betrayal. A violent, desperate kind. I felt a cold prickle on my neck. The room was the same, the dust still lying in soft layers over every surface, but the air felt heavier, charged, like the cabin itself was impatient. I read another note. I tried to warn her. That one made my heart skip. Someone had been here, hiding, whispering warnings into the floorboards. But who? And who had they tried to warn? I started moving through the cabin systematically, lifting planks, finding more scraps of paper. Each note deepened the story. He came in the night. Blood in the corner, she screamed. The words were fragmented, but the tension was clear. A brutal betrayal had happened here long before I arrived. I could almost see it, hear it. The scuffle, the quiet panic, the whispers of someone who had trusted the wrong person. A sound made me freeze. A soft tap like fingernails against wood. I spun. Nothing. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, lighting the dust in golden motes. I shook my head, trying to calm the rising dread. I was alone. I had been alone before. The cabin didn't move on its own. Or did it? Another plank creaked as I knelt to lift it. Beneath, a small pile of papers lay stacked neatly as if someone had placed them there in secret. I picked them up carefully. The handwriting was shaky, frantic in parts. Words I didn't understand at first revealed themselves in fragments. The man I trusted. Knife in the dark. I should have left. The notes ended abruptly, like someone had vanished mid-thought. I leaned back against the wall, trying to process. Whoever had written these notes had lived here, or hidden here, witnessed something violent, something unforgivable. My skin crawled with the realization that I was reading the echoes of fear, of someone's last moments of desperation. And yet the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. The notes were not just messages, they were a trap. They made the air heavier, made the shadows darker. I could feel the past pressing down on me. A faint sound of movement drew my attention. Not outside, not above, but within. The cabin breathed. Floorboards groaned in places I hadn't stepped. The air shifted around me. I could hear a whispering that wasn't coming from the notes themselves. It was beneath, in the cracks and gaps, in the spaces where the wood met the walls. A presence, patient, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move again, carefully lifting the final plank. A single note lay beneath, folded multiple times. The handwriting was clear, neat, and in a tone that made my stomach twist. He will come for what he left behind. She never saw him leave. The last line was underlined 3 times. The words seemed alive. I could almost feel the moment they were written, a hand trembling, a heart racing, and a betrayal that had shattered everything. I sat on the floor, clutching the notes. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the cabin had inhaled all the fear, all the panic, and now it was pressing it back down on me. I couldn't tell if the shadows shifted with the light or if they moved on their own, curling along the edges of the walls, stretching toward me. The betrayal wasn't just on the paper, it was in the room itself. It had soaked into the wood, the dust, the air. A creak behind me made me whip around. Nothing visible. The cabin's silence was heavy, almost conscious. I could hear the faintest whisper of movement near the corner, a soft shuffle that stopped the moment I focused on it. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting fear onto the cabin's natural sounds. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to piece the story together, using the notes as breadcrumbs. A man, trusted by someone in the cabin. Something went wrong. Violence erupted. Someone disappeared or was taken. The notes were the only survivors of the night it happened. But then another thought struck me, cold and sharp. If the writer had left these messages, were they still somewhere hidden? Alive, or worse, still trapped? I got to my feet, glancing around. The cabin seemed quieter now, but the weight remained. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight, and for a moment it almost looked ordinary. Almost. Then I noticed the faintest smudge on the far wall. A handprint, partial, smeared in old dust. Too high to reach naturally, I crouched, examining it. Another note under a loose plank nearby. She saw it too late. My heart raced. Who was she? And what had she seen? The cabin had become a puzzle, each note a fragment of a hidden story. I could feel the tension rising, the way the air thickened around me with each discovery. Floorboards shifted subtly beneath my feet, whispers echoing through the cracks. I realized the cabin wasn't just a witness, it was a participant. It held memory in every creak, every shadow, every dust-laden corner. I moved cautiously to the fireplace. The hearth was empty, but the wall behind it had a small indentation, almost hidden. Inside, I found another folded note. "Never trust him. He waits where the light fails." My stomach twisted. The betrayal had layers, and I was peeling them back, one fragment at a time. The cabin's story was alive, pulsing quietly beneath the surface. As I worked my way back toward the entrance, notes clutched in one hand, I noticed a subtle pattern. The notes weren't random. They were placed deliberately, creating a trail. Not just a trail of words, but a trail for someone or something to follow. I had walked it blindly until now. Now I understood. The cabin had guided me, pulling me into the story it had preserved. I paused near the door, trying to catch my breath to calm the rising fear. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, and for a moment I felt a fragile relief. But the cabin wasn't done. Floorboards creaked softly behind me, not from my weight. Dust shifted in patterns too regular to be wind. I could feel it, a tension, patient, deliberate. The story of betrayal was unfinished. The echoes of it lingered, waiting for someone to hear, someone to respond. I glanced at the last note again. "He waits where the light fails." And I realized with a sudden cold certainty that the cabin wasn't just hiding the past. It was preparing for the future, for me, for the next footsteps, for the next discovery. And somehow the notes, the whispers, the shifting boards, they were all part of it, pulling me deeper, making sure I saw exactly what I was meant to see. The cabin was patient. It remembered every betrayal, every fear, every secret hidden beneath its floorboards. And now it had remembered me. I froze the moment I noticed it. The way the light hit the far window, angled just so, reflecting my own movements back at me. At first I thought it was a trick of the sun, a reflection off the glass, but the more I moved, the more it seemed deliberate. The pain didn't just catch my image, it watched. I could feel it, a pressure at the edge of my awareness, like the cabin itself had turned its gaze toward me. I stepped back, heart hammering. The window remained still, but my instincts told me otherwise. I lifted a hand slowly, and the glass mirrored the motion too late, just a fraction behind me, like it was catching up. My breath hitched. Windows didn't lag. Windows didn't wait. The walls seemed to pulse. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the corners, twisting when I wasn't looking directly at them. Every floorboard beneath me groaned, soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The cabin had shifted from a silent witness to an active presence, and the windows were its eyes. I couldn't stop myself from moving closer, drawn by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the forest lay bathed in afternoon light, ordinary and calm. No one moved, yet the feeling persisted. The cabin's attention wasn't outside, it was on me. It had always been on me. A sudden creak from behind made me spin. The door frame, heavy and cracked, had shifted slightly. Not with the wind, not from the boards settling. Something small, deliberate. My pulse raced. I wanted to run, wanted to flee, but the windows kept me in place. I could feel their watchful pressure pressing through the glass, through the walls, into my bones. I moved along the side wall, eyes fixed on the window panes. Each reflection caught fragments of the room that weren't quite right. A chair where I knew none had stood. A shadow stretching too long in a corner. A handprint smudged in dust, vanishing the moment I blinked. My mind screamed that I was imagining it. Yet my fingers brushed against the cold, and the impressions were real, tangible. Something behind me whispered. Not words, not even syllables, just a sigh like the cabin exhaling. I spun again. Empty room. But the windows, every single one, caught a movement I hadn't made. The slightest sway, the smallest flicker of shadow. I realized then I wasn't just being watched. I was being studied. Every gesture, every hesitation, cataloged by these silent sentinels. I stumbled back toward the center of the room, my boots scraping the floor. Dust rose in faint clouds, settling slowly like tiny ghosts. I forced myself to breathe. Calm down. Rationalize, it's an old cabin, warped glass, tricks of light, shadows, that's all, nothing alive, nothing that could watch. And yet, the next window gave me a different angle. I wasn't moving now, just standing, and it tilted my reflection slightly. My head appeared too high, my shoulders uneven, my eyes darker than they should be. The cabin was playing with me, or showing me something. But what? The curiosity gnawed at me, dangerous and irresistible. I edged toward the far wall, keeping my eyes on the panes. Each step revealed more anomalies. My reflection lingered for a moment too long before vanishing. The corners of the windows captured shapes that weren't mine, vague figures shifting just out of focus, twisting like smoke. I blinked. Nothing, or maybe something. I couldn't tell, and that made the skin crawl at the base of my neck. I crouched, trying to steady my breathing, glancing through the grimy glass. Outside, the forest remained ordinary. Sunlight glinted off the leaves, birds moved lazily, and the wind whispered through the branches. Yet inside, the cabin hummed with anticipation, its gaze locked onto me. I realized then that the windows weren't just mirrors, they were lenses, not of the room, not of me, of the story it wanted me to see. I remembered the notes beneath the floorboards: betrayal, violence, disappearance. The cabin had preserved them, hidden them, curated them. And now the windows were revealing something else. Something alive in the spaces between the boards, in the shadows curling at the edges. I could feel a presence shifting behind the glass, and I knew it had been waiting for me to notice. I forced myself to walk past one of the panes slowly, keeping my eyes locked on my reflection. My shadow stretched behind me unnaturally long, merging with something darker. A flicker of movement in the corner of the glass caught my attention. I turned my head and the movement vanished. But when I looked back at the window, it was there again, closer this time, lingering, watching, smiling. I thought I saw the faintest curve, a shadowed grin that didn't belong to me. My heart pounded. The windows followed me as I circled the room. Each pane reflected not just my image, but fragments of the cabin's history. The shattered chair, the smeared handprint, the darkened corners. I understood then that the walls themselves were aware. Not conscious in a human sense, but alive with memory, with the residue of past events. Every pane, every reflection, every shadow held a record of what had happened here. And now I was part of it. I stopped near a corner where the light was dimmest. The shadows pooled there, and the window above caught my movement at an angle I hadn't seen before. My reflection was wrong. My head was too small, my arms too long. The room seemed to bend slightly in the glass, pulling me into it. And then I saw it, a figure just behind the reflection, obscured, shifting. Not solid, not quite human, waiting. I froze, the air grew thick. Dust particles floated lazily, catching the sunlight like a web of tiny, golden threads. I could feel the cabin watching through every surface, the boards, the walls, the glass. It wasn't malevolent exactly, not yet, but it was aware. It was patient. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I had been lured here to witness something, to play a role in a story that had been paused for decades. I stepped back slowly, watching the windows with careful attention. They mirrored my hesitation, my fear. Every reflection seemed slightly delayed, every shadow slightly out of place. I understood that the cabin had adapted, learned from the past. Every visitor, every note, every whisper had been absorbed, cataloged. And now the windows reflected not just the present, but a history of terror. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step out, slam the door behind me, and breathe the normal air of the forest. But I knew it wasn't that simple. The cabin didn't let go easily. The windows followed. They had a patience born of decades. They could wait, observe, and draw me deeper. A soft creak drew my eyes to a lower pane near the corner. Something had shifted in the dirt outside the window. Not a footstep, not an animal, just a disturbance in the dust, subtle and deliberate. My breath caught, I couldn't see clearly. The forest was empty, yet I felt it, attention, intelligence, a silent watching. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to shake off the dread. The windows remained focused, capturing my panic, my uncertainty. And then a realization hit me. The cabin didn't just hold the past. It held response. It reflected fear. It anticipated. It remembered my presence, every subtle movement, every thought that flickered across my mind. I took a step back, watching carefully. My reflection elongated, then split, two images, mine and something else. Another shadow, another figure blending with my own. It followed, waiting, patient. I couldn't distinguish the end of me from the shadow. The cabin had blurred the lines. It was teaching me something, warning me, or perhaps claiming me. I exhaled, slow and deliberate, trying to regain control. My boots scuffed the boards. Dust rose in little clouds. I glanced at every pane, trying to measure what was real and what was residue. And in one corner I saw the faintest movement that didn't belong to me, not a trick of light, not a reflection. A hand, a face, I couldn't tell, just a presence still waiting. And then it vanished. For a moment I dared to hope that it was over, that I had survived the silent scrutiny. But the windows remained, patient, unwavering, reflecting more than light, more than me. They held the cabin's memory, the betrayal, the whispers of past lives. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The cabin's gaze followed every thought I had, every hesitation, every heartbeat. I stepped toward the door, notes clutched in one hand, the other brushing a window pane. My reflection smiled back, or did it? The line between me and the cabin blurred, and I realized the truth. I hadn't entered this cabin alone. I had entered its attention, and it would not forget. I stepped outside, and the air hit me differently. Not cold, not warm, just heavy, like it carried the weight of the cabin's memory with it. Every breath drew in fragments of dust, faintly sweet like old paper and rusted nails, and I could feel the building's presence stretching through the forest, reaching toward me even as I put distance between us. I wanted to look back, but my instincts screamed not to. Still, I couldn't resist. The cabin sat there, silent, waiting. Its windows dark, yet I felt its gaze on me, sharp and patient. I realized then that leaving didn't mean escaping. Not really. Something had attached itself to me. A trace, a residue, a story I hadn't fully understood, lingering behind my eyes. I tried to shake it off. The forest was ordinary, or as ordinary as it could be. But every shadow along the path seemed to quiver just slightly, as though the cabin had stretched tendrils into the trees themselves. I walked slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth, leaves crunching underfoot, yet every sound felt amplified, as if the world had grown attentive. I could hear the faint rustle of wind through the branches, a whisper that wasn't quite wind, brushing against my ears like fingertips. I shook my head, trying to remind myself that nothing followed me, that whatever had lived inside those walls stayed there. And yet, a movement flickered at the corner of my vision, a shadow too quick, too purposeful. I turned sharply, but there was nothing, just the forest, ordinary and silent. I told myself it was a trick of light, the angle of the sun through the canopy. I told myself the cabin's stories were confined to the walls, to the windows, to the dust and the floorboards. But the unease had settled into my bones. I could feel it crawling along my spine, whispering that some memories didn't end when a door closed. I tried to focus on familiar sounds, the distant river, the calls of birds, but the ordinary now carried an edge. Every echo felt amplified, stretched. Footsteps behind me. No, just the brush of leaves, or was it? I glanced back, the cabin swallowed by trees now, almost invisible, yet its presence seemed to pulse through the air, through the soil beneath my boots. It had left a mark. I was carrying it with me. I remembered the notes I had found. The betrayal, the echoes of violence, the shifting reflections in the windows. They weren't just stories. They were instructions, warnings, lessons, and I had read them all. Now the residue lingered, a shadowing of awareness in my own mind. I could feel a subtle pressure, a hesitation forming in my thoughts, as if the cabin's gaze had reached inside me just a fraction, enough to blur the lines of memory and reality. The path wound through dense forest, the trees arching above like the walls of a cathedral. Sunlight streaked through gaps in the leaves, painting fractured patterns on the ground. For a moment I almost felt relief, the natural rhythm of the woods grounding me. My pulse slowed, my breath leveled. Perhaps I had left it behind. Perhaps the cabin stayed behind with its windows and shadows and whispers. But then the branches shifted strangely, as if avoiding something or pointing toward it. A flicker of motion along the path ahead made my chest tight. I stopped, listening. Nothing moved, nothing spoke, and yet the sense of being watched had not left me. I realized the forest itself felt different, as though it carried the imprint of the cabin. The memory of it clung to the soil, to the roots, to the very air I breathed. I kept walking, faster now, boots scraping against roots, leaves brushing against my arms. Every step felt heavier, not from fatigue but from awareness. The past was trailing me. Small things, sounds, shadows, fleeting images at the edge of my vision started to mirror fragments of what I had seen inside. A branch twisted like a shadow I had seen in the corner of the cabin. A patch of sunlight fell across the ground like a reflection in the dusty window. My mind played tricks, or perhaps it was memory made physical, a residue clinging to the world around me. I stopped by a fallen log, heart racing, trying to steady my thoughts. The forest was quiet now, almost deceptively so. No wind, no birds, just the heavy pulse in my chest and the faint echo of the cabin's presence. I wondered, not for the first time, if leaving would ever sever the connection. If the windows, the walls, the shadows had imprinted something into me that I could never erase. Something that would whisper in silence, flicker in reflections, linger in empty spaces. I looked around, trying to find reassurance in the trees. Their trunks were ordinary, their bark rough and familiar. And yet every time I glanced, shadows seemed longer than they should be, angles sharper, gaps in the underbrush darker. I could almost sense a figure moving in rhythm with me, just behind or beside, always at the edge, always unseen. My rational mind insisted it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But my body, my instincts, refused to lie. I began to notice small things, subtle disturbances that I hadn't seen before. A pile of leaves where none had been, disturbed soil as if someone or something had stepped through. A twig snapped faintly, just enough to echo in the quiet forest. I froze, trying to catch the sound, and realized it was following the rhythm of my own heartbeat, perfectly synchronized, almost sentient. The cabin's presence hadn't left. It had extended into me, into the forest, into memory. I forced myself to move again, faster this time, eyes scanning every shadow. The sunlight shifted with the passage of the day, carving new shapes across the path. Each new angle revealed fragments of something familiar, something inside the cabin. The smudged handprint, the crooked chair, the faint smile in the reflection. And I understood, in a slow, sinking certainty, that some of it had left with me. Some of it had embedded itself into my perception, into the way I saw and heard and felt. By the time the path opened into a small clearing, I could feel it, a subtle pressure in my mind, like a shadow pressing against the edges of thought. I closed my eyes, hoping to shake it off. The air felt thicker now, as though it carried a presence I couldn't see. I could almost feel eyes upon me, unseen, patient, waiting. Not malevolent exactly, just aware, attentive, watching what I would do next. I sat on a fallen log, trying to calm my breath, steady my shaking hands. I reviewed everything I had seen in the cabin, the diary, the hidden notes, the windows that watched. And now I realized the truth. The cabin story didn't end when the door closed. It traveled with me. Tiny fragments of it, imprinted in perception and memory, following me through space and time. And in quiet moments when I wasn't looking, they would return, flicker at the edge of vision, whisper through shadows. I forced myself to stand, to keep moving. The clearing gave way to a trail leading back toward the main path. Sunlight filtered through the branches, ordinary and calm. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. Perhaps the forest could absorb it. Perhaps I could leave it behind. But as I walked, I noticed the smallest details shifting. A shadow stretched strangely across the path, bending in a way that mimicked my movements. Leaves that had lain flat now tilted as if turned by unseen fingers. I realized then that leaving the cabin did not mean leaving its influence. The story had not ended. It had merely followed me out, subtle and patient, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I quickened my pace, boots hitting the dirt hard, lungs burning. The path narrowed, the trees closing in. My mind played tricks. Every whisper of wind sounded like voices from the cabin, every flicker of light a reflection from the windows. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but deep down I knew better. Some traces of the past lingered. Some fragments of the cabin's presence had embedded themselves into the forest, into perception, into me. The thought chilled me. Even after hours, even after I reached familiar trails, the images would return. The windowed eyes of the cabin would appear in reflections, in puddles, in polished metal. Shadows would twist at the edges of sight, carrying fragments of those long, silent walls. And I would remember, always. I reached the main path at last, sunlight breaking through the canopy fully, ordinary and reassuring. For a moment I almost believed I had escaped. The cabin was behind me. The windows were behind me. The shadows were behind me. And yet I felt the pressure in my mind, subtle but persistent. The story had not released me, not completely, not ever. I paused, listening to the forest, hearing the distant rustle of leaves, the faint hum of insects. And I understood, leaving with eyes open was not about escaping. It was about acknowledging the traces that followed, the memories that lingered. The cabin had imprinted itself into perception, into the way I would see the world from now on. Its story traveled with me, patient, quiet, waiting to return. I stepped forward, chest tight, boots crunching the familiar dirt. Every shadow, every flicker of movement reminded me that the past was never really behind me. The cabin's gaze, the weight of its windows, the whispers of its history, they were part of me now. And I knew in the deepest part of my mind that I would never forget. Even when the forest seemed calm, even when the path was familiar, even when I thought I had left it behind, the traces remained. A shadow at the edge of vision, a reflection in water, a hesitation in thought. I had departed the cabin, yes, but I had not escaped its attention. It followed, lingering in memory, in shadow, in the spaces I could not see. And that was a truth I would carry forever. The road curved through the valley, tight and uneven, flanked by trees whose shadows stretched long and thin in the fading light. I had been driving for hours, but the air here felt different, thick, charged, as if it knew I was coming. The sun was low, casting everything in orange and rust, and the distant hills swallowed the light faster than I expected. I slowed the truck, gripping the wheel a little too hard because I could see it then. A thin wisp of smoke curling from a chimney, twisting against the wind as though it had nowhere to go but upward. I shouldn't have seen smoke here, not from this cabin, not in Raven Creek, not from this particular building that had been abandoned for decades. The last caretaker, or so the stories went, had disappeared one autumn night, and the place had sat empty ever since. But now it breathed, just barely, just enough to draw my attention and set my pulse on edge. I parked on the dirt shoulder, boots crunching over gravel and dry leaves, and let my eyes adjust. The cabin sat crooked in its clearing, weathered gray wood splitting under age and neglect. Windows were dark, broken in places, catching the last rays of the sun like dull mirrors. And that smoke, it rose straight, almost deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light fog drifting from the valley floor, but deep down, I knew it was. My hand went to the flashlight I'd kept on the dashboard. I didn't trust my eyes alone. Not here, not tonight. I stepped down from the truck, and the wind carried the scent of something sharp, something charred, barely there but unmistakable, wood smoke and iron. My stomach tightened. I'd heard the stories. Whispers about the valley, about the cabin, about what lingered after people vanished. They weren't meant to be believed. They were warnings. Maybe they were right. I approached the cabin slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth, each step raising a whisper of leaves. The smoke had stopped rising in a clean column. It drifted now, curling like fingers reaching for me. I wanted to look away, wanted to convince myself that someone had returned to light a fire to make the cabin live for a moment. But the windows, those windows didn't reflect light the way they should. They seemed to look back, black and still, but somehow aware. I caught myself holding my breath, and for the first time, I understood what the old stories meant when they said the cabin watched. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness yawning wider than it should. I hesitated, feeling the tug of curiosity and caution in equal measure. Part of me wanted to leave, to tell myself it was smoke from a neighbor's hearth drifting across the valley. But another part, stubborn, foolish, pushed me forward. I needed to see. Inside, the air was cooler, though the chimney smoked faintly. Dust motes floated in the last light, twisting and trembling like they had lives of their own. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a low, complaining sound that seemed to echo too long in the quiet. My flashlight swept the room. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets, a hearth black with soot, walls scarred with time. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. And yet I felt it. That presence, subtle but insistent, pressing against the back of my mind like a warning. I stepped further and a scrap of paper caught my eye near the hearth. A note, yellowed and brittle, edges curled like dead leaves. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Words, jagged and uneven, scribbled across the page. He never left, not really, not even now. The penmanship was frantic, terrified. I swallowed, feeling a chill spread through me. Who wrote this, and how, after all these years, did it remain here, waiting for someone to find it? A sudden draft brushed past me, soft enough to be mistaken for wind, hard enough to make the hair on my neck rise. The smoke from the chimney seemed to pulse, as if the cabin were breathing through its old, cracked lungs. I shivered. There was a rhythm here, a subtle heartbeat in the walls, and I could feel it syncing with mine. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but my curiosity anchored me in place. I moved deeper, shining the light across the room. A rocking chair swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. The sound of it squeaking against the floor made my stomach twist. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was aware, waiting, patient. And maybe it had been waiting for me. I noticed something in the corner, a set of footprints pressed into the dust. Fresh, too fresh. I crouched, following them with my flashlight, the beam shaking in my hands. They led from the doorway toward the hearth and then disappeared. There was nothing to explain them, nothing that made sense. Yet I couldn't deny what I saw. Someone or something had been here, had been waiting. A smell hit me then, coppery, metallic, bitter, blood. I gagged, the note trembling in my fingers. I forced myself to steady my breathing. Maybe it was old. Maybe it was residue from decades past. But even as I reasoned, I felt the air shift. A faint whisper brushed my ears, too low to catch words, just the vibration of something alive in the silence. My pulse jumped. I spun, flashlight sweeping every corner. Nothing. And yet the whisper continued, curling around my skull like smoke. I took a step back, and that's when I noticed the windows. Not the black, watching panes I had seen outside. These reflected the room differently. The corners of the walls warped subtly in the glass, angles bending in impossible ways. Shadows moved in the reflection that weren't in the room. I blinked. My heart thumped painfully. I was certain I hadn't imagined it. The cabin, it was showing me something. Something I wasn't meant to see. I tried to steady myself, forcing a laugh, brushing off the feeling. I'd been in old buildings before, seen dust and drafts play tricks, but this was different. The air itself seemed aware, shifting with me, responding. My flashlight flickered once, and when the beam stabilized, I thought I saw a figure, a silhouette pressed against the wall behind the rocking chair. I spun, but there was nothing there. Only the chair, swaying faintly as if tired. I stepped toward the door, telling myself I'd had enough. I needed to leave before the cabin decided I was staying. The note fell from my hand, drifting to the floor. I stooped to pick it up and froze. Written on the back, words I hadn't noticed before. "Do not look away, you already have." My stomach turned. The handwriting was the same, frantic, urgent. I could feel a pulse of energy in the paper, like it throbbed beneath my fingers. Outside, the sun dipped below the ridge and the valley filled with shadows. The smoke had stopped curling. It hung in a lazy spiral, almost expectant. I hurried to the truck, trying not to look back. And yet my gaze kept returning. The windows glimmered faintly in the dying light, like eyes that hadn't blinked in decades. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. It wasn't empty. It waited, patient and quiet, ready to mark the next person who crossed its threshold. I started the engine, boots pressing the pedal hard. The road ahead was dark, twisting through the valley. My eyes flicked repeatedly to the rearview mirror. The cabin's outline shrank in the distance, but I could swear the chimney smoked a little longer, a little thicker, as though it were following me. My chest tightened. Some part of me knew I hadn't left anything behind. Some part of me knew it had followed, even as I drove away, even as the trees swallowed the valley into shadow. And as I passed the bend where the light finally vanished, I caught movement in the side mirror. Nothing concrete, just a flicker, a shadow leaning slightly, almost imperceptible. I told myself it was the angle, the reflection of the trees, but I couldn't shake the certainty. The cabin had eyes, it had a will, and somehow it already knew I was leaving with them open. The road stretched before me, empty and winding. The valley's dusk swallowed the last hints of light, and I drove, knowing I would never see Raven Creek the same way again. Somewhere in the darkness, the cabin waited, patient, silent, alive, and I could feel its awareness pressing against me even now, a weight at the edge of memory and perception. I didn't look back again, but I didn't need to. I already knew it was watching. I had barely put distance between the truck and the cabin when the valley seemed to shift behind me. The road narrowed, dark trees crowding in from both sides, branches scraping against each other like dry bones. I kept glancing into the mirrors, expecting the cabin to vanish completely in the fading light, but it didn't. Its roofline still lingered in the distance, and somehow the smoke, thin, curling, seemed to move of its own accord. The woods pressed closer to the road now. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the asphalt, pooling in the hollows where sunlight had no claim. I could feel eyes in the trees, not the ordinary watchfulness of animals, something deliberate, patient, waiting. My hands tightened on the wheel, and the hairs along my neck prickled as if the forest itself exhaled a warning. Then a flicker, a movement at the edge of my vision. I swerved slightly, heart hammering. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Leaves falling, wind shifting. But the flicker came again, higher in the trees, like a shadow with purpose, peering, measuring. Every instinct in me screamed to stop, to turn around, to run back toward that cabin and its dreadful safety. And yet I couldn't. I had to see what was there, lurking. The road bent sharply, and headlights cast long, uneven beams into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure, thin, hunched, slipping behind the trunks like it belonged to the dark itself. Not human, or not entirely, too angular, too deliberate in its movements. My mind screamed that it had to be someone, something observing me, calculating, waiting for a moment I hadn't yet anticipated. I slowed, hoping that my presence alone wouldn't draw it closer. The air was colder here, though the sun had barely dipped below the ridge. Fog began to form in patches, drifting like smoke rising from hidden fires. Every branch seemed to quiver as if the trees themselves were nervous, hiding secrets in their bark. And that figure, it didn't vanish. Just paused, tilting its head slightly, watching, waiting, becoming one with the shadows between the trees. My eyes caught another movement to my right. A flash of white, maybe fabric, maybe a glint of bone. I blinked and it was gone, replaced by the ordinary rhythm of trunks and leaves. My pulse surged. I thought I had imagined it until the road ahead curved into a deeper pocket of forest, and there it was again, closer, waiting just beyond the reach of the headlights. I tried to rationalize, whispered excuses to myself. Deer, a lost hunter, branches caught in the fading light, but something in the rhythm of the flickers told me otherwise. The figure mirrored my speed, always just beyond reach, sometimes in the periphery, sometimes half glimpsed in the headlights. I knew with a cold certainty that this was no accident. It wanted me to know it was there. The truck's engine hummed louder than necessary, tires crunching on gravel as I drove cautiously. The figure stayed at the edge of the woods, moving with patience I couldn't match. Shadows twisted unnaturally around it, bending in ways the trees shouldn't allow. And still, my mind reached for normal explanations. The human brain craves sense, even when sense has nothing to offer. Then, as if the woods had breathed in unison, every shadow shifted at once. I froze, headlights trembling across the road. The figure was gone, but the sensation of being watched, measured, tracked, intensified. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced into the rearview mirror. The trees behind seemed darker than they should be, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, pressing forward like an unseen tide. A sudden movement flickered again and my stomach sank. Not ahead, not behind. On the left, in the thick of the forest, a branch snapped sharply. My eyes tracked the motion, but the fog obscured everything. Only a sense remained thick and oppressive that someone, or something, had stepped closer, waiting, patient as a predator. I tried to speak, muttered my own name, the words swallowed by the wind. The valley was quiet except for the hum of the truck and my own ragged breathing. Yet I could feel it moving with me, a shadow sliding along the edges of reality, testing my awareness, probing the thin boundary between the visible and invisible. The road twisted again, tighter now, and I caught glimpses of movement in every shadow. Shapes seemed to detach from the trees briefly before merging back into the underbrush. I blinked, but each time I opened my eyes, something shifted. It wasn't the forest changing. It was me, or at least how I perceived it. The air felt heavy, almost liquid, pressing against my skin. The shadows were alive, watching, learning. I slowed to a crawl. The figure or figures stayed at the periphery, never fully revealing themselves. But small things betrayed them. A flash of white fabric, a flick of movement in the corner of a broken branch, a sudden shimmer in the fog. The valley seemed to pulse with intent, and every pulse pressed into my chest, quickening my heart, tightening my chest, forcing my mind to recognize a truth I wasn't ready to accept. I wasn't alone. I tried to focus on the road, on the immediate curves and dips, but the figure, or something like it, kept pulling my attention outward. A pattern began to emerge. Every time I glanced to the right, it mirrored me from the left. Every time I slowed, the shadows seemed to pause, waiting for me to catch up. I realized then that it wasn't just following. It was teaching me something, or perhaps testing me. Then I noticed another detail, subtle but undeniable. Among the branches, among the fog and shadow, there were shapes that didn't belong to trees. Limbs bent unnaturally, angles that twisted like they weren't meant for living things, faces turned away just enough to avoid clarity. And still, my headlights caught reflections now and then, eyes glinting in the fading light, watching, calculating. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my thoughts. There was a logic here, hidden beneath the instinctual fear. I wasn't meant to see it fully yet. Only glimpses, hints, fleeting movements that planted questions in my mind faster than I could answer them. Who or what was in these woods? What did it want? And most unsettling, why did it feel familiar, as if it had been waiting for me all along? A branch snapped again, closer this time. The figure flickered, just a shadow, but the movement was deliberate. My heartbeat synced with it. I could feel the tension in my chest, the nervous twitch in my hands gripping the wheel. And then a whisper, so low I thought it came from my own head. "Don't look away." I jerked my head left, flashlight catching a glimpse of something crouched among the trees. A face, maybe, too brief, too shadowed to discern, but it was deliberate, aware, and it stared. I didn't blink. I couldn't. And when I looked back at the road, the figure was gone. Not vanished, not hidden. Simply absent, leaving a weight behind in the air, pressing down like gravity. The valley stretched endlessly ahead, road twisting like a black ribbon into darkness. The shadows between the trees shifted and bent, but the feeling never left. Every movement of the branches, every flicker of fog, felt orchestrated to keep me uneasy, to keep me aware, to remind me that the forest had eyes. And I, foolish as I was, had walked straight into its gaze. I drove faster, but the sensation followed, pressing into the back of my skull. Even as the cabin disappeared completely behind the first rise of the valley, I could feel its influence lingering, entwined now with the shadows in the forest. The figure, or whatever had been watching, was patient. It didn't need to chase. It just waited, and I knew that I would see it again. Somewhere among the dark shapes of the trees, I felt a presence that was older than the valley itself, patient, observing, shaping my every thought. I didn't know what it wanted. I only knew one thing. It had noticed me. And that was enough to make every shadow between the trees a threat, a whisper, a warning. As the headlights passed over the last open clearing, I realized I couldn't shake it. The valley, the shadows, the flickers, they weren't behind me. They weren't entirely ahead either. They existed in the spaces I couldn't look directly at, lingering in the periphery, pressing against my awareness. And somehow, I knew they would follow. The forest closed in completely, darkness pressing against my windows, and I drove on with a single certainty. Someone, or something, was watching, and it had been waiting for me long before I arrived. And I wasn't ready to understand why. I didn't mean to find it. The recorder was hidden under the floorboards, wedged in a splintered gap, coated in dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. I pried it loose with trembling fingers, half afraid the floor itself would protest. When I pressed the play button, a hiss of static filled the cabin, like the air itself exhaling a warning I couldn't yet understand. A voice emerged from the machine, low, uneven, trembling, yet deliberate. "I didn't mean for it to happen," it said. My stomach lurched. The words carried weight, real weight more than the decades should allow. There was no background noise except the faint creak of the cabin settling. No music, no wind. Just the voice, speaking directly into the emptiness like it knew I was listening. The confession unfolded slowly, like a record skipping over itself in fits. A murder committed in the forest surrounding the cabin, someone killed in desperation, in betrayal, in fear. The speaker named no one, but the details were visceral: shouts in the trees, a struggle against snapping branches, a fall into shadows where the body would never be found. I felt my pulse accelerate. Even through the static, the terror of that night leaked into the present, crawling over my skin. I tried to tell myself it was history, something far removed from me, but the words weren't distant. They pressed into my ears like they were happening now. I could hear the forest, the soft crackle of leaves underfoot, the sudden snap of a branch. My eyes darted to the window. The woods outside were still, but somehow heavier, waiting. The air smelled of damp pine and old smoke. Something moved just beyond the frame, but when I blinked, nothing was there. The voice went on. He trusted me, he shouldn't have. I didn't know what else to do. There was a pause, a catch, a raw human shiver embedded in the recording. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear that reached across decades and wrapped itself around my chest. I pressed pause, gripping the recorder, wanting to stop it, wanting silence, but silence brought its own terror. The cabin seemed to lean closer, the walls whispering. What else had been left behind? What truths had rotted in these floorboards, waiting for someone to uncover them? I pressed play again. The voice continued, describing how the forest had swallowed screams, how the trees became witnesses, how every rustle, every shadow, every crack of wood would remember. My chest tightened. I could feel the cabin breathing, responding to the recording, acknowledging the presence of its own dark history. I wanted to leave, but the recorder had that magnetic pull. I had to hear it, had to know the story. There was a description of footprints, barely visible in the damp soil, the way someone had followed, then lost the trail. The speaker admitted to watching from the tree line, hearing the final gasp of a life ending and knowing no one would ever trace it back. And yet, the fear in the confession wasn't gone. Even decades later, the guilt radiated through the tape, seeping into the cabin's corners, whispering to me in the soft sway of shadows. A sudden crack made me jump, not from the recorder, from the floor above. The cabin wasn't empty. My hands shook as I held the device close. Could someone have been here, hiding in silence all this time, waiting to reveal themselves as the story demanded? The recording paused itself for a moment, static filling the room, and I could swear I heard a breath, low and deliberate, not my own. I stood, eyes scanning the cabin. The furniture hadn't moved in decades, or so I thought. Now the chair by the wall was slightly shifted, the rug wrinkled where my foot hadn't pressed before. The recording continued, filling the silence, but now it felt like the past was layering itself over the present. I could see the murderer's hands in my mind, trembling just like mine, hiding, searching, wondering if anyone would ever find the truth. The voice whispered the name of the victim, soft, almost regretful. I didn't know the person. I didn't know the speaker. Yet I felt an inexplicable connection, as if hearing this confession tied me to the act, tied me to the forest, tied me to the cabin itself. Every shadow in the corners seemed to pulse, moving with purpose, watching, learning. Then the tape clicked and the voice softened. I can still hear him, even now. And the static seemed to swell, to carry a presence, something unseen settling into the corners. My mind screamed to stop listening, to leave, but my body betrayed me. I leaned closer, straining for the next words, needing to know what had happened after the final gasp, after the forest had claimed its witness. A memory or a vision seemed to seep from the tape. I was outside now, walking the very forest the confession described. The trees stretched overhead, towering, limbs twisting unnaturally. Every shadow seemed to mimic the movements of someone unseen. The recorder's voice guided me through branches, over roots, toward an open space in the trees where sunlight didn't touch. And there it was. The final act played out in my imagination with terrifying clarity, leaves crushed beneath invisible weight, a gasp echoing without source. I pulled back, sweat dampening my palms. The recording hummed on. It wasn't finished. There were more names, more whispers, more guilt to confess, and every detail was drawn with surgical precision, like someone had wanted the story to be heard by me specifically. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that I was reading meaning into static and decades-old voices. But instinct doesn't lie. The cabin wanted me to know. Then I noticed something subtle. Beneath the static there was another layer. A second voice, almost imperceptible like a reply, a murmur threading through the confession. I couldn't understand it at first, but every time the primary voice named an action, the second seemed to sigh to respond. Not a person in the room, no, that wasn't possible, but the air itself, the forest, the cabin. Something was alive in the recording, interacting with the confession, creating a dialogue across decades. A sudden shiver ran down my spine. The recorder had been moved from its hiding spot once more. Not by me. I froze. The voice paused too, and I could hear a faint scuffle, almost imperceptible above the tape's hiss. My heart pounded. I wanted to leave, to throw the recorder down, to escape. But the confession had me, held me, pulled me forward with every word, with every layer of shadow and guilt. I pressed play again. He shouldn't have trusted me, the voice said, almost a whisper now, almost a plea. And I understood suddenly why it had been left in this cabin. It wasn't just a record of a murder. It was a trap, not for me in body, but for me in mind. To experience the fear, to carry the weight, to understand the forest's patience, to hear the voice of the past in the present. I realized then that the confession wasn't finished. It wouldn't finish. The tape could end, the words could cease, but the echoes would remain, stretching outward, embedding themselves into my awareness. The forest murder was never just a story. It was a living thing, carried in the cabin, carried in the air, in the shifting shadows, in the creaking floorboards beneath me. And now it had found a listener. I set the recorder down, hands trembling. The cabin was quiet, almost serene, yet the weight lingered. Every corner seemed slightly darker, every shadow a little longer. The voice had left a residue, a presence that was no longer confined to the tape. I could feel it in the floor beneath my feet, in the air brushing my skin. Watching, waiting, perhaps speaking, but only when I wasn't sure I wanted to listen. I realized something else, something terrifying. The confession might have been from decades ago, but the guilt, the fear, the shadow, the forest's memory, they were alive. And it was patient. Patient enough to wait for someone like me. Patient enough to shape perception, to guide attention, to teach horror slowly, carefully. And I was standing in the center of it, a student with no choice but to learn. I finally turned off the recorder, but the silence was louder than the static had been. I could feel it pressing into me, lingering in my thoughts. And I knew, before I even looked toward the door, that this wasn't over. Not for the voice, not for the cabin, not for me. Somewhere in the shadows, the forest still whispered, still remembered, still demanded acknowledgement. I stepped toward the exit, recorder clutched like a talisman, knowing that the voices of the past weren't bound to the tape. They had followed me into the room, into the present. And as I left, I understood. Some secrets do not remain buried. They hunt you patiently, watching, waiting for the one who will finally hear. I thought I had seen the last of it. I thought the cabin's shadows and whispers were behind me. But as the sun dipped below the hills, bleeding red through the trees, the smoke returned. Not thick, not curling like a friendly fire, but thin, stubborn, curling from the old chimney as if someone had returned to reclaim the place. My heart pounded before my mind even had a chance to argue. I stepped closer to the cabin, boots crunching over dry leaves. The air smelled faintly of ash, stale wood, and something else, something sour and coppery like old blood lingering beneath the smoke. I paused, gripping the edge of the porch. The cabin seemed impossibly quiet. No wind, no rustling, just the soft hiss of smoke rising against the night sky. It should have been abandoned. It had been abandoned. Yet here it was, alive, breathing, as if waiting for me to notice. I circled the cabin, eyes straining in the dimming light. Every window was dark, reflecting the forest in impossible depth, but the smoke moved with intent. Thin tendrils drifted across the roof, and I swear they hesitated as if surveying me, testing my presence. I wanted to leave, but something rooted me to the porch. The smell, iron and decay, was almost magnetic. My mind whispered, no one is here, nothing is here. But the chest tightening, the prickling at the back of my neck said otherwise. The first hint of movement came from the tree line. Shadows shifted unnaturally. I couldn't tell if it was my eyes, the smoke, or something in the forest itself. And then I saw it, a figure, or maybe just a trick of smoke and shadow, standing near the edge of the clearing. It didn't move the way a person moves. It didn't breathe, but it was watching, waiting, and it disappeared when I blinked. I stepped inside the cabin, boots creaking against old floorboards. The air was heavier than I remembered. Not just smoke, but a presence. I could feel it in the walls, pressing against my shoulders, settling in the corners. The recorder from before sat where I had left it, silent, as if expecting me to resume the confession. But I didn't touch it. The smoke alone demanded attention. I could hear it whispering against the ceiling, against the walls, trailing over the furniture. I moved to the window, eyes tracing the curling haze outside. It wasn't fire, not a stove, not a chimney in use. The smoke had no origin. It drifted, hesitated, almost playful, like it knew I was watching, like it wanted me to chase it, to follow. I could feel the forest leaning in, the trees bending slightly as if inhaling the smoke, swallowing it whole, only to exhale it back into the clearing. My stomach turned. Something alive lingered here, but it wasn't human. I tried to make sense of it, to ground myself. Maybe a neighbor, a hunter, a stray camper, but the woods were empty. The silence was so complete it pressed into my skull. I moved to the other side of the cabin. The smoke responded. Thin lines stretched toward me, curling, snapping, almost like fingers in the air. I stumbled back, realizing my own breathing was shallow, cautious. I couldn't look away. My curiosity had become a trap. Then I saw it, footprints in the soft earth outside the cabin. Not fresh, older, faded, but moving in a loop, coming from nowhere, circling the clearing and returning toward the woods. Whoever or whatever had been here had walked these same steps for years, decades, maybe longer. I knelt, pressing my fingers near the ground. The dirt was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell, iron, smoke, something old and bitter, coated my hands. I understood suddenly. This cabin didn't forget. The forest didn't forget, and I wasn't meant to either. I went back inside, needing distance, needing to convince myself I was sane. But the smoke had followed, a thin wisp curling along the floor, along the walls, tracing the corners as if it had found a path through the cabin itself. It wasn't just outside. It had infiltrated the very air, threading itself between me and the light. My pulse hammered in my ears. I could feel it pressing into my mind, teasing, whispering, insisting. I wanted to speak, to call out, but the words wouldn't come. The recorder's voice came back without warning, static-filled but distinct. I didn't mean for it. The confession from before overlapped with the living smoke, and I realized the air itself was remembering, replaying history in fragments. The smoke moved in time with the voice, curling into shapes that almost resembled figures, gestures frozen in a moment of terror. I wanted to shut my eyes, to block it out, but each curl, each tendril drew me deeper. I thought about leaving. I thought about stepping into the dark forest and escaping, but then I noticed the faint glow in the tree line. Not fire, not lanterns, just a light that pulsed in the smoke like a heartbeat. And with it, the realization hit me. The cabin had never been empty. It had been waiting for someone to notice, waiting for the right curiosity, the right fear. And I was it. I lit a candle, more to see than to illuminate. The smoke reacted instantly, curling higher, retreating just slightly, then settling again. The candlelight reflected on the window panes, and for a moment I saw shapes, shadowed figures lingering in the glass, faces turned away, expressions lost to the years. They were watching me, observing, waiting for my next move. The longer I stayed, the more the air thickened. Every breath carried whispers, words I couldn't fully understand, syllables formed in some language of smoke and memory. I swayed dizzy, caught between fascination and terror. What had been here before me? Who had left the smoke behind, or had it always been part of the forest, part of the cabin, part of the confession that lingered in the air? Then a sudden chill made the candle gutter. The smoke twisted violently, spiraling toward me, and I had to duck, heart hammering. The recorder clicked on by itself. Not just a replay, another message, another fragment. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. This place remembered betrayal, murder, regret, and it was still alive in the air, in the smoke, in the faintest glimmer of something beyond the window. I backed into the corner, trying to keep my mind clear, trying to separate myself from the cabin, from the air, from the smoke. But every time I breathed, it moved with me, curling, twisting, playful yet threatening. I realized then that leaving would not erase it. It didn't need a body. It didn't need a witness. The smoke alone carried the past, carried its own kind of consciousness. Patient and deliberate. Hours passed, or minutes. Time was fractured. The candle burned low, casting shadows that merged with the smoke. I could see figures shifting in the corners, not entirely human, not entirely shadow. The air hummed with memory, a resonance that pressed into my chest. And still, the smoke rose, curling, breathing, waiting. I realized that I had become part of it simply by being here. I stepped outside. The air was cold. The smoke clung to me, delicate strands brushing my face like fingers. The forest was still, yet alive, filled with the memory of the cabin, the past deeds, the confession I had uncovered. I felt watched, but not by eyes, by awareness, by a patience that measured time in decades, not minutes. I tried to take a step forward, but the smoke followed, coiling around my ankles, climbing upward into my hair, into my thoughts. I understood then that the cabin, the forest, the smoke, it didn't just haunt a place. It haunted awareness itself. It waited for someone to notice, to listen, to become entangled in memory. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But something inside me, the part that had uncovered the recorder, that had pressed play, that had lingered in the cabin despite every warning, knew the truth. There was no leaving without carrying it. Without carrying the smoke, the confession, the history, the presence that had returned tonight and refused to vanish. I turned back once more. The cabin's silhouette loomed against the darkened forest. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin, insistent, like a finger beckoning. And I realized that someone or something had returned to watch, had returned to claim attention, had returned not to harm, but to remind me that the past isn't a memory. The past is living, breathing, waiting, curling in the air like smoke that refuses to be ignored. I walked away slowly, feeling the forest pressing in. The smoke trailed behind me, thinner now, almost playful, but still there. It would not leave. Not entirely. Not ever. And I understood finally that this wasn't just a cabin or a forest or even a story. It was a presence that measured time in attention and fear, and it had claimed me quietly, without words, without violence, but entirely. And somewhere in the dark, thin strands of smoke curled around the trees, around the cabin, around me, whispering, waiting for the next moment, the next person who would look, who would notice, who would breathe, and who would realize too late that some presences never leave. The man's hand was rough, knuckles white against the metal keys. He didn't look me in the eyes, just shoved them into my palm like a warning. "Cabin's yours now," he said. His voice was low, almost drowned by the wind that rattled the signpost behind him. I held the keys, feeling the cold bite of metal, and something inside me recoiled. I didn't know why, not at first, but the way he looked at the woods beyond, like he was leaving me in someone else's nightmare, I felt it before I understood it. I turned the keys over in my hand. The metal was heavier than it should be. Each jagged tooth seemed to carry a memory, a weight I couldn't place. The cabin was remote, hidden deep in the forest, a place people avoided for reasons no one spoke aloud. Decades ago, a family had vanished there one morning to evening, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. People whispered about it in the town below, shaking their heads and shaking off the subject like it was poison. and now the keys were mine. The drive-in was long. The road narrowed, trees leaning inward until the sky disappeared into dark green. Branches scraped against the car, leaving streaks on the windows. I felt the cabin before I saw it. A vague shape through the trees, smoke curling faintly from a chimney that hadn't been used in years, or at least that's what I told myself. The closer I got, the stronger the smell of damp wood and rot became. It wasn't unpleasant, just wrong, heavy, patient, watching. I parked in front and stepped out. The forest was silent. Not natural silence, not the quiet of windless air or still water. This silence was thick, full of expectation, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The cabin looked smaller than I imagined. Paint peeling, windows dark, door hanging slightly off its hinges. Yet from somewhere inside I felt the space lean toward me. Not threatening, curious, waiting. I hesitated before the door, fingers brushing the keys. The metal felt impossibly cold. I could almost hear a faint tick, 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 like a clock counting down from decades ago. A calendar of events that no one remembered except the cabin. I turned the key in the lock. The click echoed too loudly, bouncing off walls that didn't belong just to wood and nails. I pushed the door. Inside smelled of earth, dust, old pine, and something coppery. The floorboards groaned, warped from years of neglect. I walked slowly, letting my boots stir the air, letting my eyes adjust. Furniture sagged under invisible weight, curtains hung like tired ghosts, and the fireplace was black with ash that hadn't cooled in decades, or maybe hours. I wasn't sure anymore. Time here felt wrong, compressed, ready to trap anyone who entered too long. On the counter I found an envelope. Yellowed, brittle, the handwriting small and precise. I unfolded it. Inside, a letter, not from the family, not quite. It was from the previous owner, warning me the house remembers, not people, not words, not even murder, though that was part of it too, but attention. Any awareness, any curiosity. That was what stayed, what lingered. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I moved through the cabin, inspecting room by room. The kitchen was coated in dust, but the smell of old coffee lingered, faint, like someone had poured it yesterday. The bedroom smelled of lavender and decay. I opened drawers. Nothing, yet something shifted behind me in the corners of my vision. Something waited to be noticed, and noticing it would make me part of it. Then I saw it, a small photograph, black and white, edges curled. A family of 4 standing on the porch. Smiles forced, eyes hollow. Their gaze wasn't empty. It felt like it followed me. I bent closer. The father's hand rested on the shoulder of the mother, who held a child. And behind them, barely visible through the glass of the photo, was something darker. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. I blinked. It was gone. But the memory of seeing it pressed into my chest hard. The letter I found earlier kept replaying in my mind. The cabin remembers. My keys had unlocked more than a door. They had unlocked attention, awareness, and maybe patience. I felt it then, a subtle pull, like the walls themselves were leaning in to study me. I spun slowly, half expecting the air to ripple, for the shadows to move. They didn't. Or if they did, it was just enough to unsettle, just enough to make me doubt myself. I decided to check the basement. The steps were narrow, the railing splintered, and the air grew colder with each descent. At the bottom, the faint smell of smoke, like the chimney had recently breathed, tangled with the scent of earth and wet stone. Nothing else. No light, just the damp floor and walls that felt pressed close. I ran a hand along the stone, moist, alive almost. And then I realized the shadows weren't just shadows. They shifted when I looked away, curling into shapes that teased recognition before vanishing when I faced them. Back upstairs, I found the living room. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the last light from the windows. The furniture was arranged strangely, almost ceremoniously. A rocking chair moved slightly, as if nudged by a hand I couldn't see. My chest tightened. I wanted to leave, to step outside into the forest where things made sense, where trees didn't lean in and windows didn't watch. But curiosity had me trapped. I lit a candle, its small flame trembled, casting shadows that reached further than the light. And then I heard it, faint, almost indistinguishable, a whisper. Not from the wind, not from the forest, not from anyone nearby, but from the cabin itself. It didn't speak words, not yet, just intent. a thread of presence that curled through the air, brushing against me. I wanted to run. I wanted to throw the candle and bolt, but I stayed. I had to know if the cabin would move with me, if it would respond, if it was alive. Then I noticed the keys in my hand, cold and heavy, and for the first time I understood. I wasn't given them to open a door. I was given them to enter a story that had no end, only chapters, a story that measured time not in hours or days but in attention and fear. The family had vanished, yes, but maybe they never left. Maybe they were part of the house now, folded into the wood and air and dust, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for me. I tried to place the photograph back where I found it. Something moved in the corner of my eye again. The candle flickered violently, and I thought, what if noticing them was all it took to become part of the history, to be watched, remembered, carried forward in the cabin's long memory? I pressed my fingers to the envelope again. The letter was fragile, but the words burned into me. Attention stays. The house remembers. I spent the night walking from room to room, listening, breathing, feeling the air thicken. The wind outside howled, but inside, silence pressed against the walls. I imagined the family there, in the corners, in the shadows, in the smell of damp wood. And I knew I would see them in the edges of my vision, hear them in the smallest creaks, sense them in every pull of the cabin toward me. By morning, I hadn't slept. My thoughts were tangled with the keys, with the family, with the cabin itself. And as I stepped outside into the light, I realized something terrifying. Leaving would not erase the cabin. I carried it in me now. In the memory of the photograph, in the weight of the keys, in the knowledge that some stories never end, they only wait. And somewhere deep in the forest, waiting for me to notice again, the cabin breathed. I found the box the moment I stepped into the back corner of the cabin. It was small, wooden, and perfectly intact despite years of dust collecting around it. The kind of box you'd expect to crumble, to have warped edges, maybe even collapse under its own age. But this one was stubborn, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I didn't want to touch it, yet my fingers itched with the need to lift the lid to see what it had held for decades. Inside were objects I didn't expect to see, though logically I should have. A child's toy car, painted red, chipped along the edges. A mother's scarf, neatly folded, smelling faintly of lavender and time itself. A father's pocket watch, its glass cracked but ticking softly, almost inaudible. Everything was untouched, preserved as if someone had paused life inside the cabin and walked away, leaving only whispers behind. The items spoke to me, not with words but with presence. They said we were here and we remain. I held the scarf in my hands. It felt heavier than fabric should, carrying an intimacy I couldn't explain. Smell, touch, memory, all tangled. I imagined the person who wore it, how it had brushed against their cheek, warmed them in the chill. I shivered. The cabin seemed to lean closer, listening, approving that I had discovered these fragments. And yet it wasn't comforting, not in the least. It was intimate, yes, but it reminded me that the past had left more than empty rooms. It had left echoes that could suffocate. A notebook caught my eye next. Its cover was worn, pages yellowed. I opened it. Inside were small entries written carefully, almost obsessively. Dates and times, mundane notes, mundane fears, and under it all, a strange undercurrent of dread. Mentions of things watching, of sounds that came from nowhere. The words were quiet, subtle, but they trembled with a fear that wasn't mine, and yet settled in my chest as if I had carried it all along. I closed the notebook quickly, heart thudding. Some knowledge doesn't want to be held, and I had held it. On a shelf, I found a pair of children's shoes. Tiny, worn, but polished to a faint shine, as though someone had just set them down yesterday. I knelt and touched them, imagining the child running in them, laughing in a room that no longer existed. And then, as I looked around, I realized something. These belongings weren't just objects. They were vessels. Each one held more than memory. Each one held a presence. And if I stayed too long, I would become another vessel, carrying their story, their fear, their absence. I moved carefully through the cabin, hands brushing against the furniture. Every object seemed to hum with life, a silent vibration that threaded through the air. A chair tilted just slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I froze, thinking I must have imagined it, and yet the air changed. The shadows in the corners deepened, responding to my hesitation. I wanted to leave, to step outside where the wind could carry away these sensations. But curiosity, that insidious companion, pulled me further in. In the bedroom, I found a small box under the bed, dusty, with a lock that had rusted in place. I pried it open with the tip of my knife, half expecting nothing. Inside were letters tied with twine, faded ink, edges curled, words addressed to no one and everyone. "We can't leave," one began. "They will know if we try." I paused, stomach tightening. They meant the forest, the house, or something else entirely. I didn't have answers, only the slow crawl of unease along my spine. And the letters didn't stop. Each one peeled back a layer of fear, a fragment of life interrupted, a story cut short. I lingered over the letters, reading passages that made my chest ache. They spoke of dinner that was never eaten, of arguments that never ended, of footsteps in the night that weren't theirs. I imagined the family, trapped in routines that were hollowed out by something outside the walls, or inside. I couldn't tell anymore. The cabin had a way of erasing lines, blending the living and the dead, the seen and the imagined. And the letters, those fragile strips of paper, were a tether to all of it. On the table, I found a small mirror fogged at the edges. I looked into it. Not at myself, not fully. I saw flickers, shadows that didn't belong to me. Movements just beyond the glass, fleeting. I blinked. Gone, but the reflection lingered in my mind. I realized then that the objects were warnings or invitations. Each belonging I found drew me closer, made me aware that attention was currency here. And the more I paid, the deeper the cabin allowed me to see, but at a cost. I thought about the pocket watch again. Tick, tick, tick. I put it to my ear. The sound wasn't just a clock, it was counting something else. Seconds, minutes, patience. The kind of patience that waits for someone to notice, to become aware of the story, to step into the cabin's fold. I had noticed. I had become aware. And suddenly, the idea of leaving felt impossible. Not physically, but mentally. I was already part of the narrative, a witness tethered to these forgotten belongings, to the remnants of lives folded into wood and dust. I stood in the center of the cabin, letting my gaze sweep over it. Every corner held a fragment, a fork on the table still polished, a curtain swaying though no breeze moved it, a book open on the floor, pages blank yet heavy with implication. The house wasn't silent. It was breathing slowly, methodically, alive in ways that weren't obvious but undeniable, and I was intruding. Every step, every touch, every glance made me complicit. I reached for a small music box on the mantel. It was delicate, painted with flowers. I wound it. The sound was faint, haunting, a tune that seemed familiar yet alien. I realized the melody wasn't meant for me. It was meant to awaken something, to stir echoes in the corners of the cabin. Shadows stretched, folding toward the corners, pressing lightly against the walls. I wanted to close the music box to stop the sound, but curiosity had me frozen. Listening, watching, waiting. Then I saw it. Not in the mirror, not in the corner, but in a photograph I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the mantel. A family standing on the porch, smiling, yes, but something in their eyes, something hollow and heavy, made my skin crawl. They weren't smiling at me. They were smiling through me, past me, as if the photograph itself knew the cabin would always collect attention, always find witnesses, always fold them into memory. And I realized slowly that some of these belongings were not just memories. They were invitations, and I had accepted. I spent hours, maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, exploring every corner, every drawer, every fragile envelope or trinket. The house reacted subtly to my presence. A chair shifted when I paused, a shadow lengthened when I turned, a door creaked softly though no one was there. It was alive in its own quiet, patient way, and I was intruding. Every discovery, every note, every object brought me deeper, and I couldn't escape the sense that the family's presence was stitched into the very fabric of the cabin. Finally, I sat on the floor, surrounded by the scattered belongings. The scarf, the shoes, the letters, the photograph. They all seemed to hum, a faint vibration like the pulse of something that had been waiting, patient for decades. I touched the pocket watch again. Tick, tick, tick. I realized that time inside this cabin was different, not linear, not predictable. It moved with awareness, with attention, with discovery. and I had given it mine. As night fell, I looked around the room. The candle I'd lit flickered weakly, shadows dancing along walls lined with evidence of past lives. The cabin held them all, preserved in objects, in air, in smell, in memory. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond my understanding, I felt the forest lean closer, as if curious too. Curious about who had entered, who had noticed, who had begun to carry the story forward. I left the cabin to gather my thoughts, stepping into the chill night. The wind carried the scent of pine and decay, and I knew one thing for certain: the belongings weren't just remnants of the past. They were keys, keys to awareness, to participation, to becoming part of the story that the cabin never allowed to end, and I had touched them all. I thought I was alone. I wanted to believe that. The cabin, with its preserved relics of a family long gone, felt silent at first, too silent. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but presses, waiting for you to make a mistake. And then I noticed it, a flicker just at the edge of my vision. Something moved between the shadows near the far corner. I jerked my head, heart leaping, but the room remained empty. Or at least it seemed empty. The floorboards groaned under my own weight, echoing in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind had filled the spaces between the objects with movement. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave me. Something was watching. Something that had learned patience over decades, knowing when to reveal itself in the slightest whisper, the faintest motion, enough to unsettle without revealing. A drawer I hadn't opened shifted slightly, the sound soft but deliberate. Not the way a loose hinge moves, it was purposeful, as if it had been nudged from inside. I froze. My eyes darted toward the sound, scanning. The air felt heavier here, the shadows deeper, pooling in corners as if collecting themselves. I wanted to call out, to shake the cabin, to demand that whatever was there show itself. But the words caught in my throat. I didn't want an answer. I moved cautiously, hand grazing the wall for balance, every sense alert. My breathing felt too loud. My pulse drummed in my ears. And then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound like fabric brushing against wood coming from the hallway behind me. I hadn't opened anything there. Nothing should have been moving. I turned slowly, trying to see into the dim hallway. A shadow stretched across the wall, thin, elongated, shifting as if it had a life of its own. I blinked. Gone. The hallway was empty, or it seemed empty. And yet the sense of presence lingered. A pulse of awareness, as if something was just beyond reach, waiting for me to notice it. My chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet curiosity held me there, glued to the floorboards that creaked under my hesitation. I remembered the letters I had found the night before. The small voice of a child, the careful notes of a mother, hints of fears they had hidden. And I wondered if what I was sensing now was them, or something that had come after them. The air was thick with implication. Every object in the cabin felt alive, humming faintly as if confirming my suspicions. I wasn't imagining this. Something was moving here. The shadow flickered again, this time closer, closer than it should have been. It wasn't fully formed, more like a smear across the corner of my vision, but it responded to my movements. When I stepped back, it seemed to advance. When I leaned forward, it retreated. I tried to blink it away, but each time I reopened my eyes, it lingered, patient, observant. And I realized I could feel it in my bones, not just my eyes. Its presence pressed on me in ways that words couldn't contain. I needed to ground myself, to find something tangible. I picked up a candle from the mantel, lighting it with trembling fingers. The small flame wavered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. But the shadow in the corner didn't behave like the others. It didn't warp in the firelight. It remained its own entity, a dark smear that clung to the edges of reality. I whispered, unsure if I wanted an answer. "Who's there?" Silence answered, and yet it wasn't silence. Not really. The faintest rustle of movement came from the hallway, deliberate and unhurried. Something wanted me to know it was here, but not to see it directly. The air shifted. The candle flame flickered violently. I took a step back instinctively and felt a cold brush along my arm. Not wind, not anything natural, just touch. Something unseen, deliberate, intimate in its brush. My stomach churned. I had crossed an invisible boundary. I tried to focus on the objects around me, the scarf, the pocket watch, the letters, the photograph. They had anchored me before, but tonight they seemed to pulse with attention, their presence amplified by the shadow in the corner. It was as if the cabin itself was aware of my fear, feeding it, measuring it, shaping it. Every heartbeat felt loud, every breath deliberate, as if my very awareness was a signal. I dared to move toward the hallway, each step careful, deliberate. The floorboards creaked softly under my weight, each sound echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet. And then I saw it again, not fully, just the corner of a figure flickering in the firelight, too quick to catch, too deliberate to ignore. My body froze. I didn't want to see it, yet I couldn't look away. It was patient, watching me as much as I was watching it. My mind raced. Was it a spirit, a memory, or something else entirely? I remembered the old stories I had heard of the missing family, of people disappearing into the forest near this cabin. What if the cabin didn't just preserve their belongings, but something more? Something that lingered, feeding on attention, on observation. The thought made my chest tight. I had thought I was only here to observe history, but history, I realized, might be observing me. The sound of dragging came again, closer this time. And then a soft whisper, almost inaudible, like someone breathing from just beyond my hearing. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, urgent, anxious, was unmistakable. My skin crawled. I reached for the photograph on the mantel, feeling a strange reassurance in the image of the family. And yet, even that couldn't hold back the sense of being watched, being measured, being drawn into something far older and patient than I was prepared for. I stepped backward, my eyes fixed on the corner where the shadow lingered. It moved again, subtle, almost imperceptible. I could sense it shifting to mirror my position, avoiding direct confrontation, testing the limits of my awareness. I swallowed, mouth dry, realizing the cabin wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a place where attention and fear became currency, where being awake meant being noticed. And I had been noticed. In a desperate attempt for clarity, I spoke aloud, my voice trembling. "I'm just here to stay the night, that's all." The shadow paused. For a fraction of a second, I thought it might retreat, dissolve into the corners. But then it stretched slightly, leaning toward me as if acknowledging my words but not respecting them. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it wasn't neutral either. It was aware, alive in ways I couldn't define. I turned slowly toward the living room, trying to keep my gaze steady, searching for some anchor. The candlelight cast shifting shapes across the walls, and in each flicker I imagined it. Behind the table, along the ceiling, brushing against the walls. And I understood this was the truth of the cabin. The shadows, the movements, the faint noises, they weren't tricks. They weren't malfunctions of memory or imagination. They were witnesses, participants, extensions of the lives that had ended here. And I had invited their attention simply by arriving. I wanted to leave. I wanted the fresh air of the forest outside, the indifference of the night. But every instinct told me I couldn't, not yet. Curiosity, that insidious companion, had me rooted to the floorboards. I had to understand, had to see. And I realized something terrifying. The shadow wasn't just moving. It was learning. Every step I took, every glance I spared, every moment I lingered, the cabin remembered. And it would not forget. I held the candle high, casting my own shadow across the walls. For the first time, I thought maybe I could see it clearly, maybe understand its intentions. But it moved differently now, deliberately avoiding direct confrontation, as if it knew visibility was a trap. And I understood I wasn't meant to see it fully, only to feel it, to acknowledge its presence. And in that acknowledgement, I became part of the story. Hours passed, or minutes, I couldn't tell. The shadow never left, never advanced too far, never receded completely. It existed in a space just beyond perception, a patient observer of my fear, my hesitation, my human need to understand. And I understood, finally, that leaving the cabin didn't end the observation. It only paused it. Wherever I went, the memory of that presence would follow. The cabin had marked me. As dawn approached, I finally set the candle down, letting its flicker die. The shadow lingered in the corners, almost imperceptible now, patient, waiting. I knew it would remain long after I left. The cabin would hold it, protect it, let it stretch between walls and floorboards, pulling at the edges of memory and perception. And I would never forget it. I stepped outside, the cold air biting, my body tense. Behind me, the cabin stood silent, almost empty, but I knew the truth. It wasn't empty. It never had been. And the shadow, patient and observant, would wait for the next visitor to notice, to step inside, to become part of the cabin's quiet, insistent story. I thought leaving would feel like relief. I thought stepping away from the cabin, the shadows, the lingering memories would lighten my chest, make the weight on my skin disappear. But the moment my boots crunched against the frost-hardened dirt of the forest path, I realized I was wrong. The air had changed. The cold no longer felt natural. It was deliberate. It pressed on me, heavy and patient, like the world itself was waiting for me to turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on the cabin, shrinking in the distance, its wooden edges blurred by the early morning mist. But I could feel it, not the building itself, but the awareness it had left behind. The shadows, the movements, the silent gaze that had studied me as closely as I had studied them. Every step forward felt measured, as if the ground beneath me remembered where I had been, who I had been, and was tallying it. The trees shifted in the wind, or maybe they didn't. A branch scraped against another, but the sound was too precise, too timed, too pointed. I paused, hand on the strap of my bag, chest tight, listening. Nothing moved. And yet I felt eyes on me. Every instinct screamed to look back, to catch sight of something that hadn't followed me physically but was present nonetheless. I didn't. I couldn't. I forced my gaze forward, toward the path that led out of the forest, toward roads I knew and towns that felt safe. My mind replayed every moment inside the cabin, the letters, the photographs, the shadow that had mirrored my movements. I thought I had left it behind, that by stepping outside I had broken some invisible tether, but I was wrong. The forest seemed to hum with expectation. Each rustle of leaves was deliberate, each distant bird call too intentional. I imagined shapes moving between the trees, just beyond the edges of perception. I wanted to tell myself it was imagination. I wanted to tell myself I was leaving fear behind, but the truth settled heavy in my chest. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was carrying it with me. The path curved, and for a brief moment the cabin disappeared from view. Relief washed over me, thin and fleeting like a candle guttering in wind. And then I felt it, the touch. Not physical, not air or brush against my skin. Something else, something patient, deliberate. Awareness. It was a gaze that didn't blink, that didn't falter, anchored somewhere in the distance behind me. My stomach lurched, my hands tightened on the straps of my bag. I would not look. Every step forward was heavy with dread. I imagined the shadow moving, following, not in the physical sense, but tethered to my perception, an echo of a tension that had once been alive in the cabin. I thought of the family, the objects, the notes left behind, and I realized they hadn't wanted to be forgotten. The cabin, the shadows, the stories, they waited for recognition, for acknowledgement. And in my curiosity, I had given it to them. A faint sound came from behind me, subtle, almost ignorable. But it wasn't wind. It was deliberate, a scrape against stone, a hollow exhale in the distance. My boots paused, my body stiffened. I told myself I was imagining it. The rational part of my mind insisted on logic. Nothing could follow me this far. And yet the hairs on my neck stood rigid, and I felt that same weight pressing, waiting, measuring. I forced my pace, legs moving despite the growing fear. The forest began to thin, the trees further apart, shadows stretching long in the morning light. Yet the sensation did not leave. If anything, it grew. I felt eyes tracking me from every dark shape, every shifting pattern of bark and foliage. I imagined figures peeking from behind trunks, shapes that had no substance yet undeniable intent. They didn't need to move quickly. They only needed to exist, to observe. And I was aware of every one of them. A road came into view. Asphalt, cracked and faded, cutting a straight line through the forest. The familiar brought a flicker of calm. Civilization, logic, normalcy. My heart slowed slightly, relief spreading through my limbs. And yet in that same moment I felt it again. Closer this time. Not the shadows of the forest, not the echo of the cabin, but something else. Something aware of the boundary between the wild and the ordinary. It lingered at the edges of my perception, patient, watching. I forced myself to keep moving, Step after step, breath after breath. The road promised distance, escape. But with every step, a whisper of memory brushed against my mind. The candle in the cabin, the shadow that mirrored me, the deliberate touch of air that was never really air. The forest and the cabin had marked me, and the mark was patient. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It only needed me to notice. And I had. Cars passed on the road, ordinary vehicles, ordinary sounds, ordinary people. For a heartbeat, the world seemed normal again. I dared a glance behind, just a flicker at the edge of vision. Nothing. Just trees, morning mist, and the fatting silhouette of the cabin. Relief, deeper this time, began to seep into my chest. Maybe I was free. Maybe the forest had released its hold. And then a smell hit me, smoke, faint and deliberate, curling in the air behind the trees. Not fire, not recent fire, but something that belonged to the cabin, to the shadows, to the presence I had felt pressing on my skin. I stopped, heart pounding. The road ahead beckoned, the world seemed safe, but the smoke lingered in my mind, a promise that not everything had left. That awareness followed, that the shadows waited, always. I forced my steps forward, leaving the smell behind, leaving the cabin behind, leaving the shadows in the morning light. But I could feel it, the patience, the silent observation, the echo of all that had watched and waited for decades. It wasn't in the cabin anymore, but it was still with me. And I knew it would follow, subtle, patient, persistent, until I forgot to notice, or worse, until I returned. Every mile I put between myself and the cabin made the air feel lighter, the morning sun warmer, ordinary life more tangible. And yet the sense of being watched never faded completely. I imagined the shadow stretching between the trees, between moments, between perception and memory. It didn't chase. It didn't need to. It only existed, waiting for acknowledgement. And in that waiting, I realized the story didn't end. I had not left it behind. I had carried it with me, unknowingly, inseparably. The road curved again, and I saw the town in the distance. Houses, familiar shapes, the promise of interaction, normalcy. Relief poured through me, raw and tangible. And yet that same instinctive chill ran down my spine. I dared not look back, not once. Not at the trees, not at the fatting cabin, not at the smoke that might or might not have lingered at the edge of perception. To look would invite acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would bind me to what I had felt, what I had seen, what I had known. I kept walking, every step deliberate, every breath measured, letting the town grow larger, the forest shrink behind me. But the truth settled in my chest like a weight I could not shake. I would never be entirely free. The cabin, the shadows, the smoke, the awareness, they had marked me. And one day, whether I wanted to or not, I would feel their pull again. For now I walked, step after step, departure without looking back. But in my mind the cabin remained, patient, waiting, aware. And I knew deep down that leaving didn't erase what had touched me. It only delayed it. And somewhere in the quiet of the distance, I imagined movement in the edge of the trees. Not fast, not urgent, patient, observing, always observing. The forest swallowed the road long before the cabin appeared. Trees leaned over the asphalt like they were watching, their limbs heavy with frost and shadow. I should have felt relief when the last sign of civilization disappeared behind me, but instead there was only a hollow thrum in my chest, a warning I couldn't name. The map had ended at this point, marked only with a crooked X where the cabin waited. I drove slowly, headlights cutting weak cones through the mist. Each turn seemed longer than the last, the bends tightening, the darkness pressing closer. The air smelled damp, earthy, and strange, as if it hadn't been breathed by anyone for decades. My fingers gripped the wheel, knuckles white, heart ticking in rhythm with the tires rolling over unseen stones and frozen soil. And then I saw it, the cabin, alone, last in a line of abandoned shelters the map had hinted at but never shown. Its wooden walls sagged, paint peeled like old skin, windows dark and blank. Smoke should have risen from the chimney. Life should have been visible. Instead, it sat like a thing waiting, patient and deliberate, aware of my approach. I parked, engine ticking down, and stepped out. The air hit me immediately, cold, sharp, and strange, heavy with a silence that wasn't natural. Even the wind seemed hesitant here, curling around the trees but never breaking the hush. I felt it first as a shiver up my spine, then as a tightening in my chest. Eyes, I thought. Something was watching, but there was nothing to see. Only the cabin, framed in mist, silent and waiting. The steps to the door were uneven, cracked, like the forest itself had grown them. I approached slowly, hand on the rough wood, feeling its age, its history, its weight. The door was locked. Of course it was. Abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place no one would visit willingly. I shook my head and tried the handle anyway, half expecting it to open on its own, to invite me inside. It didn't. The key was in my pocket, cold metal, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the cabin's past in its weight. My hand trembled when I slid it into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, a sound far too loud in the enveloping silence. I paused. Should I open it? Should I step inside, knowing I was crossing a threshold that had been avoided by everyone else? I did. The door creaked on its hinges like a warning, opening to a room dimly lit by the weak gray morning filtering through the frost-lined windows. Dust swirled in the shafts of light. Furniture sat scattered like memories frozen mid-motion, chairs tipped, a table half set, a blanket still draped over the edge of a bed. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. And yet I felt it, the weight of presence, as if the cabin had inhaled in anticipation of me stepping across its threshold. Footsteps echoed in my own ears as I moved through the space, each creak of floorboard magnified. I tried to rationalize it, old wood, cold settling, but the rational voice was weak, quiet, and it felt irrelevant here. The air smelled faintly of smoke, old and lingering, like it had been waiting for decades for someone to notice. And maybe that was what it wanted. Recognition, witnesses, someone to feel its history, its absence, its loss. I explored cautiously. Every object spoke of the past, the chipped cup in the sink, the coat hanging by the door, a journal lying open on the floor. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, and scrawled in ink that had bled like water over paper. I flipped through it, careful not to tear it, and found names, dates, small notes of normal life. And then it stopped, abruptly. The entries ended in a smudge of ink, as if the writer had vanished mid-thought. A noise caught my attention, a scrape, soft but deliberate, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, heart pounding, breath shallow. The rational part of me whispered, an animal, a branch falling outside, but it wasn't outside, it was here, just beyond the reach of the morning light. I held my breath and turned slowly, convinced nothing would be there. Nothing moved. And yet I was certain I had glimpsed a shadow, stretching just at the edge of perception. I moved toward it, compelled, curious, and terrified all at once. The floor beneath me groaned in protest. The shadow didn't shift, didn't flee. It simply waited, patient, deliberate. I felt eyes somewhere, something following me, assessing me, measuring me. I swallowed hard. The rational mind screamed for escape, for distance, for air, for life. The other part, the part that had come for answers, urged me forward. A smell, wood smoke, faint and old, rose from the corner. I froze again. This cabin hadn't burned recently, not enough to produce smoke now, and yet it lingered, curling into my nose, coating my tongue. Pressing on my chest like a memory made physical, I reached toward the corner. Nothing, empty, and yet I knew it was not empty. I stumbled back toward the center of the room, trying to shake the sensation. Light shifted as the clouds overhead moved, the room breathing with a life that was not its own. Every object seemed to watch me, every surface held a memory. The cabin's silence was not empty, it was attentive, watching, waiting, and I was its guest, its witness, its intruder. I explored further. Every door opened to another frozen memory. Bedrooms untouched, a kitchen in mid-preparation, chairs overturned as if in a hurry, and then nothing. And in each space the presence lingered, patient, deliberate. A weight on my skin, my chest, my mind. I could not see it, I could not name it, but I felt it. Always there, waiting, tethered to the past that would not leave. I reached the back of the cabin, where a small window looked out onto the forest. The mist lay thick between the trees, and for a brief moment I felt relief. Perhaps outside, beyond these walls, life existed, normal life. And then movement. Slow, deliberate, a shadow slipping between the trees, gone before I could focus, leaving only the feeling of being observed. I stepped back from the window. The room seemed smaller, the shadows longer. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, to step back into the forest path, to return to roads and civilization. And yet I could not. Something rooted me here, curiosity mingled with fear, a need to see, to understand, to know why the last cabin in the forest waited for me. I lingered in the silence, listening. The floorboards settled. The walls exhaled. The air shifted, carrying whispers of what had been, echoes of what had disappeared. I imagined the people who had lived here, walked these halls, placed their cups, scribbled in journals, and vanished. The absence was loud, the silence alive. And then I heard it clearly. A faint creak, a sigh, something deliberate behind me. I spun, heart hammering, eyes straining. Nothing. Only the room, empty but full of memory, and the cabin itself, patient, deliberate, watching. I realized then that this cabin had chosen to reveal itself to me, to allow me entry. But in doing so, it had claimed my attention, tethered me to its past, its silence, its shadows. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of its story, woven into the frozen moments, measured in every creak, every whisper, every weight of presence that pressed upon me. I stepped outside briefly, letting the cold forest air hit my face. The mist clung to my clothes, smelled of earth, decay, and memory. And in that air I felt the cabin watching still, waiting for me to return, patient and deliberate. I knew I could walk away. But I also knew the forest, the cabin, the shadows, what had happened here, would linger in my thoughts, in my dreams, in my waking moments. Always. I lingered a moment longer, then turned my back to the cabin. My boots crunched against frost-hardened soil, and I left the forest path behind. And yet I knew, even as I walked away, that I had not left the cabin at all. Its silence, its shadows, its waiting presence had entered me, and some part of me knew that it would never let go. I woke to the cabin breathing, not in the way old wood creaks or floors settle, but like it had inhaled slowly through some unseen lungs, holding the night inside its walls. Darkness pressed against my eyelids, even though the window let in faint gray light from the fog outside. Something in the room had changed. Something was closer than it had been when I went to bed. I tried to shake it off. Just nerves, I told myself. The isolation, the forest, the stories of disappearance. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate scratch, like nails on wood. Not outside, not from the trees, it came from inside the cabin. I froze, listening, my heart thudding so loud I was certain the sound would carry to whatever was there. The scratching repeated, slower now, methodical, as if whatever it was testing the strength of its confinement. I rose quietly, bare feet touching cold floorboards, tracing the sound to the corner of the main room. A door I hadn't noticed before, dark oak, old and almost seamless against the wall. Its lock glinted faintly, blackened with age, unyielding. The scratching came from behind it. I could feel the vibration through the floor, subtle but definite. The sound made my chest tight. My mind scrambled for explanations, rodent, wind, but the rhythm didn't match anything natural. It was deliberate, patient. I pressed my ear against the door. The smell hit me first, faint, coppery, metallic, like rust and old blood. My stomach turned, but I stayed. I had to know what was behind it. Had to. The key I had brought from the outside rested in my pocket, heavy with expectation. But I hesitated. Some part of me, rational or not, screamed that some doors weren't meant to be opened. The scratching stopped. Silence fell so thick I could hear my own pulse. I leaned closer. Then a whisper of movement, soft, wet, almost like breathing. I jerked back. My palms were sweaty, heart racing. The door seemed to pulse, alive with whatever had been trapped inside. I circled the cabin, avoiding the locked door for a moment, trying to calm myself. Each room whispered of the past, the bed left unmade, a chair toppled, the kitchen untouched, frozen in some daily routine long abandoned. But everywhere I looked, shadows seemed to twitch, corners deepened. I kept glancing back at the door. The scratching had begun again, slower now, like something testing my patience, daring me to cross the threshold. I tried to reason with myself. It's just a cabin. It's just old wood. Nothing in there. but my own voice sounded hollow, weak. The air seemed heavier here, pressing on my lungs. Even the dim morning light felt inadequate against the weight of the dark corner where the door waited. I sat in the chair closest to the door, trying to observe without drawing attention. Minutes passed. The scratching grew louder, softer at first, then sharper, faster, like claws dragging across the surface, seeking purchase. I realized with sudden clarity, the sound wasn't coming from the other side alone. It was resonating through the floor, vibrating up into my feet, into my chest. It was calling me. I looked at the key, cold metal. I knew I shouldn't, but I stood anyway, each step toward the door a battle with the growing unease. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to press against me like I had stepped underwater. My hand hovered over the keyhole. The scratching stopped as soon as my fingers touched the lock. Silence. My reflection in the dark wood stared back at me, pale and trembling. I turned the key. The lock resisted, stiff, but then gave with a reluctant click. The door swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges. Darkness spilled out, deeper than the room behind me, black like it had been preserved in shadow for decades. My breath caught. The air that escaped smelled of decay, damp wood, and something I couldn't name, something alive. I stepped inside. Dust motes hung like tiny ghosts in the narrow shaft of light I carried with me. The room was small, almost coffin-like, and the ceiling low. Nothing obvious moved. The floor was littered with fragments of wood, shattered remnants of furniture, but there were no signs of life. And yet I knew I was not alone. I saw the marks first, scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, not old, fresh. My stomach turned. Something had been trapped here, or waiting, or both. The realization settled in like ice. I wanted to turn and flee, but curiosity, horror, and some grim sense of duty held me there. A soft hiss of air brushed my neck. I spun. Nothing. Only the shadows twitching at the edges, stretching toward me as if aware of my presence. My breath came fast. Every instinct screamed for me to leave. And yet I could not look away from the far corner. Something shifted there, barely noticeable, almost a trick of the light. But I knew it moved. Patiently, deliberately, waiting. I forced myself closer, noticing the floor. Small scratches etched across the planks, leading to a dark stain I hadn't recognized at first. The pattern was chaotic, frenzied, yet strangely deliberate. Something had struggled. Something had tried to escape, and maybe it hadn't succeeded. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I backed out slowly, each movement deliberate, careful not to provoke whatever lingered. The scratching began again, soft at first, teasing, circling the door. I pressed my ear against the frame. A whisper. Not words, not sounds I could name, just a vibration that seemed to seep directly into my skull. My fingers tightened around the edge of the door. My mind spun. Then a change. The scratching slowed, precise now, forming a pattern almost like a heartbeat. Tap, pause, tap, pause. My pulse matched it. I realized I had been holding my breath, and exhaled in a rush that sounded like a scream in the silent room. The rhythm continued, unbroken, patient, deliberate. I stepped outside, slamming the door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. My back was against the wall, my head spinning. The cabin felt larger now, the shadows deeper, more attentive. I knew the locked door had been only a small part of the cabin's history, one layer of the stories waiting to reveal themselves. I paced the room, forcing my thoughts into something tangible. The forest outside whispered, branches brushing against the windows like fingers seeking entry. The air smelled faintly of smoke again, like it had seeped from the locked room, lingering in the cabin's veins. I realized with a sinking feeling that the cabin itself was alive in a way I couldn't name. Alive with memory, with absence, with whatever had been behind that door. Night pressed against the cabin then, heavier than before. The fog outside thickened, curling around the walls, pressing into the cracks, making the darkness inside seem deeper. I lay on the floor, knees to chest, listening. The scratching returned. Not constant, but deliberate, testing, patient, waiting. It was no longer a sound alone. It was a presence, shaping the room, filling it with something I could neither see nor name. I kept my eyes open until sleep finally claimed me. But even then, I dreamed of scratches, of the door shaking, of shadows pressing closer, watching, waiting. I woke before dawn, the air cold and silent, the locked door exactly as I had left it. And yet I knew it was not empty. I knew it never would be. The cabin had shown me its secret. It had allowed me a glimpse into the layers of its silence. But it had not released me. Not fully. The scratching would continue tonight and the nights after, a reminder that the past lingered here, deliberate, patient, and unwilling to remain hidden forever. I left the door alone, at least for now. But as I moved through the cabin, I could feel eyes in the shadows, measuring, calculating, waiting for the moment I would return. And deep down, I knew I would. I woke before dawn, the kind of early where the forest seems to hold its breath. The cabin was still, but something in the corners of my vision twitched, as if it couldn't quite decide whether to exist or vanish. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, that my sleep had been heavy with the memories of the locked door, the scratches, the shadows. But when I turned over in bed, I noticed it immediately. Footprints in the dust, leading from the door I'd left closed, scattered across the floor in a path I hadn't taken. They were small, uneven, jagged, like someone had walked on tiptoe trying not to be seen. My stomach clenched. I hadn't been alone, and yet the cabin was empty. That much I knew. I followed the prints cautiously, tracing their path with my eyes before daring to touch them. They led to the fireplace, then across the room, looping back toward the far corner where the shadows always lingered. Each step seemed deliberate, purposeful, a message I couldn't read yet. My hands were cold, my fingers tingling as though the prints themselves carried electricity. On the wall, faint scratches marred the plaster, tiny gouges that weren't there yesterday. I ran my palm over one and it felt fresh, sharp beneath my skin, like someone, or something, had marked its presence while I slept. My throat tightened. I had no explanation for this, none that made sense. The cabin's history crept into my mind, the disappearances, the stories, the locked rooms, and the scratching that had haunted me the night before. The footprints and scratches felt like a continuation of that story, a whisper that the past was still here, lingering, waiting. I moved slowly, each step measured, listening to the soft creaks of the floorboards. Something shifted behind me just at the edge of sight, and I froze. The shadows were alive. I could feel them stretch, recoil, lean toward me, and then recede. Every object in the room seemed subtly out of place. A chair not quite angled the same, a cup on the counter slightly rotated, a blanket draped unevenly. Tiny things, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me I wasn't alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cabin settled. Maybe the wind shifted things. But the prints didn't lie. The scratches didn't lie. The subtle rearrangement of the space didn't lie. Something had moved here while I slept, and now it was waiting. I approached the far corner, the one that always felt deeper than the rest of the room, as if the shadows pooled there like water in a cavern. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, only to remember the cabin's wiring was too old for modern convenience. I struck a match instead. The flame flickered, throwing the shadows into sharp relief. I could see the walls clearly now, the scratches zigzagging across the plaster like veins, the faint marks of someone dragging their fingers along the surfaces. The floor bore more signs, tiny scuffs as if something heavy had shifted across the boards. My heart raced. I felt the air thicken, pressing against my chest. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but some dark curiosity held me in place. The footprints were gone, vanished as though they had never existed, leaving only a chill in the air where they had been. I moved to the windows, pushing aside the fog that clung to the glass. Outside, the forest was silent, gray shapes blurred by mist. But then I saw it, a small clearing behind the cabin where the fog thinned and the earth looked freshly disturbed. It wasn't just a forest. Someone had been here. Someone had watched. I shivered, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. I returned to the room, trying to make sense of the scratches on the walls. They weren't random. They formed patterns, subtle, almost like letters, though no language I knew. My mind fought to see coherence where maybe there was none, but the sensation of being observed grew stronger. I could feel the cabin's history pressing in, as if it wanted me to notice, wanted me to understand that I was part of its story now. Then I heard it, a faint movement, soft, deliberate. Not the creak of the floorboards, not the wind. Something shifted behind the corner, something small, quick, unseen. I spun, match held high, but the corner remained empty. And yet the feeling persisted. Someone, something had been there just moments before. I started inspecting the objects. A chair overturned slightly, a book on the shelf facing the wrong way, a knife lying flat when I remembered it had been angled. Every minor change magnified my unease. The cabin was alive with traces of fear, leaving me to navigate its quiet, subtle terror. A low groan from the ceiling made me jump. The cabin's bones shifted, I told myself. But then I saw the plaster, thin and cracked, tremble in one place. A small indent pressed against the wall as though someone or something was testing it from the other side. My pulse surged. I was not imagining this. The presence was real, watching, waiting. I moved toward the staircase, noticing more scratches, deeper now, like claws had clawed in frustration. My shadow stretched along the walls, merging with the scratches, almost like I was being absorbed into the history of this place. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth, the same smell that had haunted me in the locked room. It was a signature, a reminder that the cabin kept its secrets in layers, and I had only peeled the first few away. I paused, hearing the soft scrape of something sliding across the floor behind me. I didn't dare turn. Every instinct screamed flight, yet my legs were rooted. The cabin had drawn me into its memory, and it wanted me to see, to feel, to understand the traces left behind by those who had vanished. I explored the kitchen next. Cups, dishes, pans subtly out of place. The drawers were slightly ajar, hinges groaning. I noticed faint streaks on the countertop, tiny smudges that didn't belong to me. Someone had been here recently. That much was undeniable. The presence lingered, a ghost that left proof, yet remained unseen. I examined the staircase. Dust lay thick on each step, but the middle bore tiny footprints, bare, uneven, the shape of someone small. They led to the attic door, which was closed tight. I hesitated, staring at it. I could feel the air press heavier at the top of the stairs, a tangible weight of something waiting, something patient. I thought about the family that had vanished decades ago, the stories I had heard before arriving. The cabin had a memory. It preserved moments, preserved traces of people who had passed through or disappeared within. The footprints, the scratches, the subtle rearrangements, they were a language of absence, of fear, a message from those who had come before. The scratching on the walls began again, light at first, then deliberate. Tap, tap, drag, pause. The attic door trembled slightly. I held my breath, straining to hear. My hand hovered over the knob. Part of me wanted to run, but another part, a darker curiosity, wanted to open it. To finally see the source of the traces, the footprints, the fear that had been left behind. I stepped back, trying to force my mind to logic. The attic could be empty. It could be nothing. But the cabin's atmosphere told me otherwise. It had been waiting for me to notice the patterns, the movements, the proof of life where there should have been none. The traces of fear were real, and they were patient. I spent the day moving slowly, cataloging the subtle changes. Each object, each scratch, each footprint reminded me of presence, absence, and the inevitability of something watching. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Corners held more depth than they had a morning ago, and the air itself seemed to pulse with unseen breaths. By nightfall, the cabin felt alive in a new way. It was no longer just old wood and abandoned furniture. It had memory, intent, a deliberate presence that stretched beyond the visible. The scratches told me stories I couldn't fully understand. The footprints proved I was not alone, and the objects out of place whispered warnings in silence. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft creaks, the faint scuffs, the distant tap-tap of movement I couldn't locate. The cabin's traces were everywhere. The history of fear was stitched into its walls, floors, and furniture, and I was now a part of it. Sleep was uneasy. Dreams swirled with footprints leading down hallways that didn't exist, scratches crawling along the walls like living veins, and shadows bending toward me with patient attention. I woke before the moon dipped below the horizon, sweating, heart racing. The traces had multiplied in my dreams, the scratches deeper, the footprints more pronounced. I stepped into the main room, eyes scanning. Everything seemed unchanged at first glance, but I knew better. The cabin spoke in small gestures. Each object subtly shifted, each scratch marked a history I couldn't ignore. And somewhere just out of sight, the presence that had left these traces waited, watching, patient, hungry. I didn't sleep that night. The footprints, the marks, the objects out of place. It was all a warning, a promise, a record of those who had come before and those who would follow. And as I moved through the cabin, I realized the traces of fear were never meant to be solved. They were meant to endure, to remind anyone who entered that some presences could not be seen, only felt. I found it tucked behind the charred remains of the fireplace. The paper was brittle, singed along the edges, curled as if recoiling from the air itself. I almost didn't touch it. There was a weight in the silence around me, a pause that made even breathing feel loud. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. I unfolded it carefully, wary of the ash that clung stubbornly to my fingers. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, trembling. A story spilled across the page, raw and intimate, written by someone who had lived or died within these walls. I could feel their presence in every word, their panic, their obsession, their solitude. They wrote of a companion who had vanished, a friend, a lover, maybe a sibling. Someone who had been here and then suddenly gone. The writer's tone shifted with every line, from despair to rage, from hope to bitter accusation. I read about the early days when the cabin had seemed peaceful, even comforting. But that calm had not lasted. Slowly, paranoia crept in, first in small acts, the hiding of objects, whispers in the hall, shadows that didn't belong to the room. The writer described nights spent awake, listening to the faintest noises, their minds stretching thin with anxiety. And then came the obsession, the need to control what could not be controlled, to know what was unknowable. I could hear their voice as I read. It was a whisper in my head, cracking with desperation. The words spoke of doors locked from the inside, of footsteps that appeared where none had been, of walls that seemed to shift while no one was watching. Every sentence tightened the air around me, made the floor beneath my feet feel less stable. The letter itself seemed alive, a relic of someone who had become part of the cabin's memory. Then the tone changed. Betrayal. They wrote of someone trusted who had turned, who had laughed quietly while the writer's world collapsed, who had hidden truths in plain sight. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was physical. Objects moved, doors left ajar, locks tampered with. There were hints that the other person, if they had ever existed, had drawn something into the cabin, something unseen that fed on fear, something patient. I paused, my eyes tracing the jagged words, feeling the weight of history pressing down. The handwriting twisted, illegible in places, scorched by fire, leaving only fragments. I could sense the writer's final hours in the cabin, the isolation, the gnawing terror that had consumed them. They had tried to destroy the letter, maybe to warn someone, maybe to erase their own mistakes. But it had survived, imperfect, half-burned, like a memory refusing to die. My fingers trembled as I held it closer to the candlelight. Every flicker made the shadows dance differently. I imagined the writer packing, whispering to themselves, checking the windows, the locks, the corners of the room where nothing should have moved but did. And then I felt it, an echo of that fear, stretching across time, brushing against me. The letter recounted nights spent hearing scratches along the walls, doors opening when no one was near, objects subtly rearranged. Footprints had appeared in dusted floors, only to vanish when pursued. The writer's mind had frayed under the weight of the unseen, each day blurring into the next, until reality itself seemed untrustworthy. I could almost see the footprints, the marks on the walls, the faint smudge of a hand where it shouldn't have been. A name appeared, scrawled in bold, desperate letters. The person the writer had loved, feared, hated. I don't know why it caught me. the cruelty, the intimacy, the revelation that someone had caused all of this. But it did. The air around me felt heavier. My hands shook. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin as though it too understood the confession. I read on. The obsession had turned violent, the betrayal had turned sinister. The letter hinted at a presence, something that had been coaxed into existence by fear, by jealousy, by isolation. The writer described how it moved unseen, how it fed, how it watched from corners, ceilings, floors. They didn't name it, but the terror bled through the paper. Each word was a footprint in the psyche, a scratch across the walls of my own mind. I realized I was holding my breath. The candle flickered, throwing the room into an uneven light, revealing subtle changes I hadn't noticed before. A chair slightly angled, a book face down on the shelf. The small disturbances I had thought were my imagination were written in the letter as warnings. The cabin's memory was not dormant. It was patient, observant. It preserved the fears of those who had entered and amplified them for anyone who remained. The letter's last page was almost destroyed, the edges blackened, curling like the wings of a dead bird. Yet the final lines were legible enough. The writer begged, warned, confessed, cursed. They described the final night when they realized the cabin itself had a consciousness, that it had absorbed the betrayals, the obsessions, the fears, and it would not let them leave untouched. The scratching, the footprints, the shadows, they were all a part of this memory, this history, this entity. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see movement where there was none. But the air was thick with tension, heavy with anticipation. I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breath, but the cabin seemed to pulse alongside me, as if aware of my thoughts, my presence. The final words lingered, almost a whisper against my ear. Do not trust what leaves no trace. Do not believe the walls are still. Do not be alone. It watches. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it against my chest. The fear in those words didn't belong to me, but it wanted me to feel it, to carry it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. Every object in the cabin seemed to shift subtly, a reminder that the presence the writer had feared was still here, patient, waiting. I couldn't ignore it. The scratches, the footprints, the objects out of place, all were part of the same story. The letter was proof. The cabin's history wasn't gone. It lingered in air, in dust, in memory, and now it had a new witness. I placed the letter back behind the fireplace, but not before photographing it, hoping that preserving its words outside the cabin might somehow contain its power. But even as I stepped back, I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the faint brush of something watching just beyond the light. I could not explain it. I could not make sense of it. Night fell and I lit the candle again. Shadows stretched along the walls, reaching, retreating, always aware of me. I read and reread the letter in fragments, memorizing its warnings, its confessions, its terrors. I tried to imagine the writer's final moments, the isolation, the despair, the creeping certainty that escape was impossible. And then I realized something chilling. Their story was not over. Not really. Every new occupant, every new witness became a part of it. I was now a character in the narrative, a new layer in the cabin's memory of fear. The scratching returned softly, almost politely, as if testing the boundaries, as if reminding me that the cabin was alive in ways I could not see. The shadows quivered slightly, more pronounced than before. The letter had revealed the truth, and with revelation came responsibility. I knew now that the cabin held its occupants in memory, that fear was stored, sharpened, preserved. I could feel it pressing against me, a tangible weight in the quiet room. I lay awake that night, the candle guttering, the letter tucked safely behind the fireplace, and I thought about the betrayals, the obsessions, the isolation described within it. I thought about the unseen presence, patient and enduring, and I understood that the traces of fear were never accidental. They were deliberate, carefully curated, a record of terror meant to endure, meant to teach, meant to warn. And yet, even as I lay there, I knew a part of me wondered what it all meant. What had been real, and what was the cabin's memory? What would I do if it tested me, if it tried to draw me into its history as it had drawn the writer? I could feel it waiting. always waiting. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the subtle creaks, the faint scuffs, the occasional soft tap-tap that might have been the wind or might have been something else. The letter had shown me what fear could look like, sound like, feel like. It had revealed the past, but it had left the future uncertain. And in that uncertainty, I felt the weight of being watched, of being observed, of being remembered. The cabin held the story. I held the letter. And somewhere in the shadows beyond sight, the presence waited, patient and aware, ready to continue the tale with its new witness. The cabin door creaked shut behind me, and for a moment the sound felt wrong, too sharp, too final. I paused, hand on the handle, my fingers trembling. The air outside was colder than I expected, heavier somehow, as if the forest had been holding its breath while I was inside. I could feel the weight of the letter, folded and tucked in my jacket pocket, pressing against my ribs. It was as though the cabin had entrusted me with its memory, and now I was stepping into the wider world carrying something alive, something that didn't belong to me. The path ahead was narrow, twisted with roots and fallen leaves that crackled underfoot. I should have felt relief leaving the cabin, but the opposite happened. Each step into the woods stretched the silence, making it sound deeper, more insistent. The wind moved through the branches like fingers brushing across skin, gentle but probing. I kept my eyes forward, though every instinct urged me to glance behind, to check if the shadows of the cabin were spilling after me. I remembered the letter. The writer had warned about being alone, about the way the cabin preserved fear, how it lingered, how it watched. I had thought leaving would end that presence. But now, stepping into the forest, I realized the fear hadn't stayed inside. It followed, slipping through my awareness, whispering in the cracks between leaves and shadows. The trees themselves seemed taller, older, watching me. I could almost hear the scrape of unseen branches, subtle enough to doubt, but precise enough to unsettle. I tried to focus on the physical, the path, the rocks, the uneven ground. My boots made soft thuds against moss and soil, but with every step I noticed more. A branch snapped behind me. I turned sharply, convinced I'd see movement, but the forest was empty. Or at least it seemed empty. The absence of something didn't comfort me. It made the air thicker, the dark between the trees denser. I kept walking, faster now, but the feeling of being observed grew heavier with each pace. Halfway down the trail, I noticed footprints. Not human, not animal, not any pattern I could immediately identify. They were shallow, as if something had moved silently over the moss, careful, deliberate. My heart rate quickened. I stopped, bending close to examine them, but they disappeared into the undergrowth, as though whatever had made them had melted back into the earth. I felt the same chill I had when I read the letter, a recognition of something patient and unseen. I whispered aloud, though I didn't expect an answer. "Who's there?" My own voice sounded strange, thin, swallowed by the trees. Silence answered. Then a rustle, soft, closer than the last sound. Not a branch falling, not an animal, something else. I spun, but the shadows held only themselves. I tried to tell myself it was nerves, imagination. But the imprint of the cabin's memory was fresh in me, and it made the woods feel alive, like they had learned from the fear stored inside the cabin. I walked faster, the forest thickened. Moonlight struggled to reach the forest floor, filtered through ancient branches. Shadows pooled at my feet and stretched impossibly long in front of me. Each tree looked like it had a face. I thought I saw movement in the periphery, a dark figure slipping between trunks, but when I turned, nothing was there. Only trees, only leaves, only the wind whispering through them. And then I heard it, a whisper just beneath hearing, like a word caught in a sigh. I stopped. My ears strained, my pulse thudding loud in my chest. The voice was familiar in tone, though I could not place the words. I took a step forward. It repeated faintly, unmistakably, "Do not forget." I froze, every nerve alive. The whisper felt impossibly close, yet no one was visible. My mind flashed back to the letter, the words of the writer, their terror, the presence they had feared. And suddenly I understood. The forest, like the cabin, preserved memory. It held the traces of all who had walked its paths. Every scream, every betrayal, every moment of isolation, every fear, it lingered here, absorbed by bark, moss, and shadow. I tried to convince myself to move, to keep walking, to ignore it. But then I noticed another thing, small objects out of place. A shoe, worn and dusty, barely visible in the moonlight. A scrap of fabric snagged on a branch. Marks on the tree trunks, long, shallow scratches, too precise to be random. My stomach turned. The traces weren't just residual fear. They were reminders, deliberate, as if the forest itself was cataloging those who entered, and I was now part of its ledger. I remembered the footprints, the letter, the whispers, and a knot of dread tightened in my chest. I realized slowly that leaving the cabin hadn't freed me. The woods were an extension of it, and the presence, the fear, had followed. It didn't need walls to contain it. It didn't need doors. It only needed patience, and the forest had time. The whisper came again, clearer, closer. "You cannot leave," my throat tightened. I forced myself to step forward, faster this time, though the undergrowth clawed at my boots. The air felt thick, almost tangible, pressing against me, slowing my movements. The path twisted in ways I hadn't noticed before, as if the forest itself was redirecting me, folding space around me. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining it, but even my own rationality felt like a fragile veneer. A faint clearing appeared ahead. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. The moonlight revealed more of the strange traces, circles etched in dirt, leaves arranged in odd patterns, the faint outline of a human shape pressed into the soil. I stepped closer, compelled despite fear. The shape was incomplete, abstract, yet unmistakably deliberate. The forest had recorded someone's presence here, and it was whispering that it would record mine too. I heard another sound behind me, a soft crunching that didn't match the undergrowth. I spun, heart hammering. Nothing. Only trees. Only shadows that seemed to stretch longer than reality allowed. I realized with a chill that I could never truly be alone in this forest. It remembered everyone who had walked its paths, and perhaps in some way it demanded that they remember it in turn. I moved through the clearing, trying to keep calm. Every sense was heightened, attuned to the subtle hints of presence, the slight rustle behind a tree, the distant shift of shadow, the barely there vibrations through the soil beneath my feet. The whispers were soft now, almost melodic, threading between branches. "Do not forget, do not leave." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me, cataloging, observing, preserving. I pressed forward, following the path, but the forest seemed endless, twisting, impossible to navigate. The more I walked, the more the trees seemed to lean subtly, as if observing from angles just beyond sight. The wind carried fragments of voices, fragments of memories, a laugh, a cry, a plea. They layered together into a tapestry of horror that enveloped me. I could feel the forest's memory pressing against my mind, teasing, drawing me into its web. I stopped again. The whispers had ceased, leaving only the soft sigh of the wind. I bent down, examining the ground, more footprints, not mine. They circled, careful, deliberate. My pulse spiked. The forest had not forgotten the letter, the cabin, or the writer, and now it remembered me. I could almost see the faint outline of a figure, always just beyond the edge of vision, moving with patience I did not possess. I started walking again, slower now, careful, aware of every shift in the earth, every sound in the canopy. My hands shook. The letter in my pocket felt hot, alive with the cabin's memory. I realized the forest didn't just contain secrets, it was alive with them. It preserved the traces of all who entered, recording them, whispering them, folding them into the living structure of the woods. The path began to widen, and I glimpsed the edge of the forest ahead. Relief surged in me. The tree line promised escape, a return to the world I knew. But even as I took a deep breath, I heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but a voice, clear and deliberate, carried on the wind. "We remember." I froze, staring at the light beyond the trees, feeling the pull of the forest behind me. It was not an evil intent, not a threat as I understood it. It was memory. It was patient. It was eternal. The forest kept what was placed inside it. It did not forget. And now I realized with a shiver I had left something behind. I had become part of its story. The clearing widened and I stepped out, the forest receding but not entirely. Its presence lingered, a weight at the edge of my awareness. I turned once, a quick glance over my shoulder, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a shadow among the trees, a figure watching, waiting. I told myself it was imagination, yet deep in my chest, I knew it was not. The woods held their secrets and they would hold mine too. I walked on, faster now, the whisper fatting behind me but not gone. The forest had imprinted its memory into me. I could feel it in my pulse, in my breathing, in the small, nagging fear that refused to fade. I realized then that leaving the cabin had been only the beginning. The woods themselves were an extension of the cabin's watch, and they preserved the traces of all who entered. Even now, with the trees behind me and the open world ahead, I feel it. Patient, persistent, unseen. The whispers, the footprints, the memories, they travel with you if you let them. I do not know if I will ever stop hearing them, feeling them, remembering them. But I do know one thing: the forest does not forgive, does not forget, and never releases what it holds. And in the quiet moments when the wind stirs and the shadows twist, I hear the faintest whisper, almost comforting, almost deliberate. Do not forget. The woods remember everything, and now so do I.